Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Keeping You Company, a podcast where Rukamani and I ramble on about topics which are interesting to us. Firstly, to teach us things about the world that we live in and to learn from our experiences, and to keep ourselves company, and hopefully to keep you company too. So sit back and relax, grab a cup of tea, or start doing some chores, or whatever it is you'd like to do while listening to this podcast. And I hope you're having a good day and a good start to the year. And if not, then I hope this podcast helps you feel a little bit better. Hello, Rook. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am very good indeed. For this podcast, by the way, for letting people know, in case you're watching, if you're just listening, that's fine. But if you're watching, then we have some footage from a place in the north of Scotland called Inverness. Anybody who grew up in the Highlands of Scotland will know that this is like the place to go, even though there's not much there. Um, so during the summer, I went there with my wife for a couple of day trips. Made the journey over there, and yeah, but I mean, it's not you're not gonna see much of the town. It's mostly just the river, literally the River Ness. There you go. It's a small place. That's all it's got. But there you go. My wife's getting quite annoyed with me at times because we've been trying to have a nice romantic walk together, and I'll just suddenly just stop and take video. She thought I was just taking photos. And I'll be standing there after
Oh,
5 minutes. She's like, "Why are you always videoing water?" It's like, it's for the podcast. It's for the podcast. So there you go.
oh, that's too funny.
So she was just going off on her own, and then I just find her like further down the path, just sitting on a bench. Like, oh, finally!
Yeah.
I think it's
The double-edged nature of the picturesque.
exactly yeah. Um,
Which, by the way, I found out. So I don't know if the viewers have been clued in. And by the way, I just want to say I realized I didn't wish you or wish that we could help keep you company at the start. So let me do that now. I second Scott Sword's hopes that this talk, in some way, shape, or form, helps you to feel like you've got some voices on in the background that are just having a friendly conversation that you can enjoy and forget some time to. But yeah, I don't know if I've told people I've been doing this project where I've been going back and I've picked up some annotated versions of Jane Austen's novels, in part inspired by conversations I've had in and around recording this podcast. And I've learned that the picturesque is actually a sort of specific term for an aesthetic principle as laid out by very specific people. And it comes up a number of times in Jane Austen's novels. Already it's come up. I'm going through it rather slow because I'm reading the novels, fairly relatively slowly on my own, just without reading any of the notes. And then I'm going back and reading them again with the annotations. So it's taking me some time. But I've finished the first one I started, which was Northanger Abbey, and I'm on to Sense and Sensibility. And in both of them already, particularly in Northanger Abbey, there's a moment where one of the characters is trying to teach the main character about the characteristics of the picturesque. And they have this sort of funny conversation about what is or isn't picturesque, and maybe the person who's receiving the lesson hasn't fully understood, and it was kind of funny in a way that I couldn't have followed if I didn't have these annotations. So I just think it's interesting that picturesque has just come to mean like pretty,
yeah,
basically
yeah.
beautiful, and just an entrancing view. But it actually stemmed from a very specific opinion about what made for like dynamic, engaging scenery to when you're composing art that you should be drawing, right? I think that's super interesting.
Ah, fascinating. I had no idea. Oh well. Hopefully the footage in the background is at least picturesque. Maybe not the picturesque.
Yep,
um,
maybe.
I have to tell Mrs. Scott Sword about your progress because she's also a big Jane Austen fan. She the unfinished novel of Jane Austen was called Sanditon. I believe that's what it's called, and
Yes.
she's recently binge watched all three series of that. Um,
Oh, they adopted it, huh?
uh huh.
Wow.
And then today, what does she watch? Oh, she finished
I guess they
watching
get to.
Mansfield Park. That's another one of Jane Austen's, I think, right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah.
I guess they can make up their own ending if it's an unfinished Jane Austen.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, I don't know. I don't. I mean, obviously, I'm no expert, but I don't know how far through they got in terms of like where the novel finished.
Hmm.
There are three series of Sanditon, sorry, seasons, I guess you would call it, right, of Sanditon.
Right.
So I don't know at what point it starts becoming pure, fiction of the screenwriters of the TV show rather than being, you know, obviously the characters are based on what Jane Austen put together. But that's
Hmm.
also another thing. I don't know how many of the characters were actually in the book, or they had to invent new roles to make the story work. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, 'cause I mentioned that to you. I think off camera. I think we talked about that. So yeah, yeah, yeah. My wife has all the books, but she will regularly go to all the various adaptations, the films, and then the BBC series and all this. And yeah, yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen any of the adaptations myself. I feel like I should, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm sort of reluctant to do it because to me, a huge part of the draw of Jane Austen is the way that she writes
Mm,
in a way that I think it's hard to like capture in an adaptation. Just because unless you have a narrator who's going to narrate everything, which people tend not to like in an adaptation, like I have a hard time picturing how you could make some of the like particular charm of Jane Austen's work come to life. Now, maybe that's an argument for checking it out and being astonished at the successes, because I know there are failures so that people generally do not regard as good adaptations of Jane Austen's work. But I also have heard that there are some very beloved adaptations, and so I think that could be really interesting to sort of reference. See,
you know what's gonna happen now. This is gonna become once Translation Born, at least for now, gets wrapped up and put on hiatus. You're gonna have to start a new channel and do some. I don't know what sort of nice pun you could create here, but where you analyze the the novel and like screen adaptations of Jane Austen's work and go through it. Why did the screenwriters choose that dialogue? Why did they
yeah,
change it? I think that's sort of it.
yeah,
The dialogue of the characters could remain true to the original, but then I'm sure the conversation will be cut shorter. And then you miss all the descriptive aspects of and like the internal like monologue of I don't know how I mean I haven't read any Jane Austen if but maybe characters normally have can't speak today internal monologues and that obviously is all lost the minute you put it onto the big screen or the small screen in terms of the TV. So yeah, you'd lose quite a lot of that. But
yeah.
I'll have to ask my wife what she thinks about that. She has read some of them, or if not all of them. But she does not need any reason or any excuse not to watch Colin Firth.
Oh, I see.
um,
Yeah, I do
and
think
Emma
I
Thompson.
like I said, I think it would be super interesting to do a comparison where I just read through a Jane Austen work. Maybe not this time, because I go back to Jane Austen with some regularity. So maybe not this time, but next time. Yeah, like you said, maybe after Translation Born.
There you go. There's your new
And be like,
project. You're welcome.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I've got a few other ideas about other projects.
Oh,
I have so many projects. I'm so project oriented. It's ridiculous.
hmm Um,
Uh,
well, we'll find out. Well, I guess we'll find out in a few episodes' time which of those projects has been chosen
hmm.
to be carried forward. How has the start of the year been? I don't know. I can't remember the last time we spoke. I know it was obviously for the beginning of. We're recording this in the middle of February. We're actually recording this on Valentine's Day. Funny enough, this is our Valentine's Day date.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
Uh, what's been going on? Boy, it's been a whole it's been a whole blur. I'm trying to get Translation Born to a state where I think I've talked in the podcast before about how I was hoping to do a sort of replay of the original version 1.00 of the Japanese version specifically of Bloodborne, starting on the 10-year anniversary of that game's release. So I'm sort of working up to that, and in order to do that, I need to stop doing Translation Born. So that series sort of has to go on hiatus. And in order to make that happen, I've got one more episode to do, and then I want to come out with an announcement actually on my channel rather than on this podcast, uh, and make sure that everybody's aware of what's going to happen. So I've been working on getting that ready, which has kept me fairly busy because February is a short month, and I like to do monthly releases. So I'm trying to make sure I don't miss the deadline for Translation Born before I take, however long, some number of months off. So I've got that going on in the background, and then I've got actually fairly steady work, which is, I think I was saying maybe even in the last podcast, that's pretty unusual for me. It tends to be either a lot all at once or relatively quiet. And it's actually been fairly steady lately. So that's been going on.
Good.
Yeah. How have you been since the last time we were able to connect?
Um, Good. Just yeah, saying kind of increasingly getting busy, but probably in the wrong ways. But good. I mean, we've work is picking up for me as well. Not the work I was intending for this year, but I'm not going to complain about money coming through the door, so to speak. So that's good. It's keeping me busy. But it's kind of weird. It's like the work is a little bit. It's even though it's scheduled every week, it's not in nice chunks. So it's I find myself with a little bit of spare time in between each bit, and then that can lead to very little productivity. But I'll have to try and manage that a bit better. I probably will. I think the big thing, I don't know if we talked about it much on the previous podcast, but I've switched over to Twitch, and that's just become this sort of uh, really what's the word, like it's overtaken my life a little bit, especially because it's so new.
Yeah.
And I managed. I was very fortunate. I've had a lot of support with it, in terms of people coming out to watch and that. And I've managed to hit affiliate level already, within only a month of streaming. So if anyone doesn't know, affiliate is basically like there's like different levels to where you can be in terms of Twitch viewership and stuff. And affiliate is like the second level. So once you get a certain number of followers and average viewers, then you can become affiliate, and that's where things start becoming monetized if you want them to. My objective was never for it to be monetized, but by becoming affiliate, it opens up a lot of sort of interesting stuff for the viewers, right? They can collect channel points. We can have like funny emotes, and I can have more stuff going on the screen, or ways that people can interact with me. So if it just makes the experience better for everybody, then I've gone ahead with it. But the business, it just suddenly opened up in the space of a day. Once it got confirmed I've got this affiliate level, all this stuff suddenly opened up, and I'm trying to get my head around, making my own emotes and connecting sound effects to the stream and all this sort of stuff, and just trying to get my head around it. So it's just too easy when I should be doing something. I was going, oh, I'll quickly, I'll quickly make some emotes or something for the stream. But and obviously then I'm having to stream. I'm streaming quite regularly. I'm looking at like 3 or 4 times a week. But that will settle down eventually into once it gets into a state which is, once not that the novelty's worn off, but once I've got it all into a state that I'm happy with it, then it's just it'll just tick over on its own. So it's quite a good thing. So I'm trying to keep into the routine of having a schedule, because then it's also good for the viewers. They know when I'm live and stuff. So, but it wasn't what I was planning to do, because I was, especially after sort of once around Christmas time, I was thinking, right, let's transition on the YouTube channel to do a lot more strategy guide videos. So I actually go into like more into video creation rather than streaming. But
Mm-hmm.
streaming is just too much fun,
Yeah. As it turns out.
as it turns out. I mean, I've said it on stream, but the thing that's been really positive with me for the stream is not only the interaction with people, which is really nice. It's kind of similar to like the vibe of this podcast in terms of it being. I'm not playing anything which is ridiculously, fast paced. I'm not playing something like Call of Duty or whatever. I'm not getting toxic with the game or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I might do strategic stuff like digital board games, but it's still chilled out with like nice Spotify music in the background and whatever. Um, but it's like the interaction with people has been great. But it's also the fact that streaming has allowed me to get back or to commit more to games that I might not have ordinarily done so. I've had a really bad habit, and again, this might be something we'll talk about more when we do like the mental health slash burnout episode at some point. but I had a really bad habit of, especially post-pandemic. This was really bad post-pandemic, but also happened before the pandemic, where I'd go onto Steam, I'd boot up a game, and then by the time it got from Steam and through the loading screen into the main menu of the game, I'd lost all appetite to play.
Oh,
And
wow.
and I would not. It's almost like the same thing. I mean, I think a lot of people might connect with this with watching films or TV shows on Netflix. It's almost like there's too much choice and you don't know what you want to play or watch, and then you spend more time trying to choose the thing you want to play or watch rather than actually consuming that activity. Um,
Yeah.
and and just the idea of even like some of the things I'm doing like Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you go into and you build a theme park, just seeing like this blank canvas just scares me. I'm just like, oh, I'm not in the mood for this right now, and you turn off, and then that's why I often end up playing things like nothing against it. There's nothing. I'm not saying I'm gonna go away from this, but like Fear of Dracula or Wingspan, because
Hmm.
you ask for a game, somebody says yes, and right for this period of time, whether it's 45 minutes or half an hour and a half or whatever, I'm committed to this game.
Yep.
It's not like this, open ended, I've got all evening, 3 hours or whatever it is to play something, and then you're trying to, how on earth am I going to fill this time?
Hmm.
So I've now gone through, I don't know how many scenarios on Roller Coaster Tycoon on stream.
Hmm.
It's almost like presenteeism, right? That there are other people tuning in to watch, so it makes you more motivated to. You're doing it. I'm doing it for me, but I'm
Yeah.
also doing it for them. Whereas
Yeah.
if it's just for me, it's just too easy to go. I'm not going to do it,
Yeah. Oh,
which is
it's very
awful.
true. I feel like that's probably that's got to be amplified on when you're streaming on Twitch and it's all like happening live. I can say just from my experience of recording myself playing Bloodborne, like I used to just go around and play that game whenever I felt like it, and because I love the game. And ever since I started recording for Translation Born or the Chalice Chats or something like that, it feels like, well, if I'm going to play the game and I don't record it, am I really playing it?
If there's no proof, did it happen? Yeah,
Yeah,
did it actually happen?
yeah.
Yeah, I
It is.
know. Yeah.
It's like no, it's like you can still just sit down and have fun, do whatever you want. And I've occasionally made myself be like, okay, this is a mini milestone. It's not something that, for instance, I want to pause Translation Born for and like throw up to the entire internet. But it's a mini milestone. So like it's Halloween. I'm feeling like playing a game that's in Bloodborne's general sphere, and I was like, I'll just sit down and try something with the game that I never tried before and have fun with it. So it hasn't like completely shut that down, but it's taken a big bite out of it, which is kind of funny to notice in myself. And it sounds like you are having the same issue, like amplified for Twitch.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so weird. I don't quite know how why this has happened, because I do remember during the pandemic, I played through the whole of The Witcher, and anyone who's played The Witcher 3 knows how open-ended that game is.
Hmm.
Um, and that'd be the sort of game that would be too overwhelming. But I just got sucked into that game so much, and
Hmm.
I mean, I can't remember how long the main storyline is, but I think I put over 100 hours into the main story and the first DLC, because I was just going off and exploring every single nook and cranny I could find, and I'd go into
Hmm.
it going, right, I'm going to play for 2 hours tonight, and I'm going to do this specific mission. We're going along this quest line, and then 2 hours later, oh, I've done none of that. I've spent 2 hours helping a village or whatever, and so it's just so weird that I did all that, and now I really struggle at times to open up a game and even play it for half an hour. Um,
Yeah.
it was actually somebody came into the Twitch stream and said the way you got to try and do it is uh, you not force yourself. I don't want to make it like sound like it's like it's something that's compulsory, but tell yourself I cannot quit within the first 10 minutes of doing something, and then that gives you time to sort of get going and find something that you're interested in, and then you'll be off. It's just too easy
Hmm.
to quit after 1 minute. But no, the streams have been great actually, because it just means I know, right, people are going to be tuning in. If there's banter in the chat, great. If not, I just know that people are lurking in the background and they're hopefully enjoying what they're seeing. The problem I'm having with the Twitch, I've got now too many games I want to play. I've already got a
Uh,
full enough schedule as it is, with board games on one night, Roller Coaster Tycoon on another night. Now I'm going this big build on Tiny Glade, so I'm gonna have to commit to that at least once a week. I want to play through Age of Empires 3 campaigns. That's another nostalgic trip for me. And I bought loads of games at Christmas. I was like, how am I gonna get through all this stuff? It's not gonna happen, but it's fine.
Wow.
It's definitely been a very positive thing to have done. So I'm really happy I've made the switch over to Twitch. Not that I'm off YouTube or anything, but it's uh,
Yeah.
it's definitely been a
Yeah. Oh, and
positive sort of venture.
you've you've reminded me on the subject of overambitious stuff. I wanted to follow up because I watched the Abroad in Japan series of him cycling across Japan.
Oh, did you?
And
Oh, fantastic.
yeah,
Uh huh.
I've now seen the entire video series,
Hmm.
and boy, what an ambitious project.
Oh, see, actually, now
Two,
maybe we didn't mention that in the actual podcast we did, but I remember there was a story he talked about in the book. So, how did it come across in the video? Tell me, how did he state the project from the
so
offset?
well, at the start, right, the whole plan, and I think this came up when we were talking about like our back and forth about the book that he wrote. But at the start, he was thinking, okay, I'm going to release daily videos of me cycling across Japan and gather all this footage. He was talking about in the wrap up video that he did, he was talking about how he was trying to cycle over 50 kilometers a day. And then he had a team of people who were helping him record, but he wanted to be the one to edit everything. So he had to do like a full time video editing job on top of him, like trying to cycle across Japan all day and then spend all night trying to edit videos so that they could get out daily. And like apparently he kept to the schedule for the first week, which is sort of a miracle in and of itself. Uh, and then, but the scope of his plans, which I think we talked about that part already, that I was like, yeah, you can't really do that. Like having the personal experience of just having walked Japan without having trying to turn it into a vlog, right? I would barely be good for anything by the time I finished a walk. I can't even imagine sitting down and trying to edit a video after that.
Right.
And I myself had plans of being like, I'm going to do all this stuff. And like, it felt like torture when I got to certain points along the route where I was like, it's been a long time. I'm at a major, like, uh, sort of milestone moment. I should send people postcards. And so I would stop and I would send postcards to my friends and family. And you could get these unique little stamps. They have like very specific, unique stamps to each. I don't know if it's region or specifically post office. I think it might just be regional, but at the very least, it's regional. If it's not down to the level of the post office, you can get unique stamps um, that you can only get there. And so I would get these unique letters and send them home and all this, and it was such a pain in the neck to to try and just write, 10 postcards or something like that
Right.
when I was walking all day. I can't even imagine sitting down to edit a video. Uh,
So I think
so that in and of itself is fairly ambitious. And then on top of it, he was like, I'm going to coordinate so that I get to meet up with all these other people who are vlogging about life in Japan, and we're going to go on stages through the journey together. And on top of that, he also was taking viewer submitted challenges where they would randomly select a challenge for him to complete during the time he was cycling through the day. So some of them he was like, okay, like speak only in Japanese for today, or like navigate using only a paper map instead of GPS, um, or uh, get someone to say journey across Japan, right? Or get three people, right? Three Japanese people to say journey across Japan. And I was just like, every single additional layer that I kept learning about this project, I was like, what a nightmare.
right. I think if I remember rightly, because I can't remember if this came up in the podcast or if, because now I read the book and now this conversation reminded me. I can't remember. It's all blurring into one. But in the end, the series didn't finish until something like, was it like 18 months or 2 years after he
Yeah.
actually finished the whole cycle or something?
18 months from when he started it is when he
Right.
finished. And then the cycle, I think the actual cycling portion of it took like exactly according to his plan, which probably would have been, I don't know, some number of weeks. It wouldn't have been 18 months
Right. Oh yeah, of
because
course. Yeah.
I walked the whole country in 3 months, right? So it has to have been shorter than that.
Right. But I think there's the fact then I can't remember how he did it, but there were a lot of people who were expecting these daily uploads and then were very perplexed when the
Yeah.
daily uploads suddenly stopped coming. But yeah,
Yeah.
that just sounds like a recipe for disaster. All that stuff that you're putting on you. Yeah, yeah. you have to just riding the bike enough is a challenge enough on its own, let alone all the other layers of complexity on top. Just, rein it in, or like do what you did. Like you had the right. I mean, I know maybe when you were walking, maybe you didn't have the idea, but the fact that you wrote a blog about it, but after the fact, you had that time to reflect and
Well, yeah,
go
sort
through
of.
all the photos and stuff, rather than having to try and do it on the fly. Um,
Yeah. Well, the photos are what ended up saving my life because I like another one of my ambitious plans. I told you I was struggling with postcards. I was also struggling with a journal. I was like, I'm going to keep a written record because by then I had done a series of hikes to lead up to my walk, and I had done a hike over Mount Fuji, and I kept a journal as I was doing that hike, and that was totally reasonable. And I remember I've looked back since and been like, oh, this is cool. I have this entry that I wrote. Like I can flip back to this page in the journal and see what I wrote while I was at the top of Mount Fuji, which was super cool. I was like, I want to do that for all Japan, and boy, that lasted that lasted a number of days. And then I got further and further behind and just had to abandon the journal entirely. If I hadn't had those photos, I never would have been able to write up that blog. And even then, I did the blog like 10 years after the fact. So yeah,
I think
just I'm much less ambitious than Abroad in Japan, and I give him a huge amount of credit for accomplishing all that he did. Like you can tell by the time he gets to the later videos, even watching it back later where you don't have the like inexplicable gap in time between each video that like kept extending.
right.
You can tell just from the subjects of the videos, he ends up cutting one of his guests entirely because he was so worn down he couldn't use the footage from it.
Uh,
And it starts focusing less and less about like there are periods in the series where he's doing like time lapses of him and his guests on the bikes to like showcase their journey, and it gets to be more and more like away from that and more towards like destination style videos where it's like, hey, I'm in this city, this is what I'm doing in the city when I'm not cycling. So it's like, yeah, I can see what's happening with this series. He had way too much on his plate.
yeah,
But even so,
over ambition is a thing, and burnout is a thing. You gotta
yeah,
avoid it
and
as
even
much as
so,
possible.
I will say I recommend the series. It was a lot of fun to watch from
I'm
start
sh-
to finish, especially because you can just binge it now if you want.
mm-hmm. No, definitely take a look. Yeah, it sounds decent.
Yeah, and I also figured out the discrepancy in the difference because in the distance because he was saying 2,000 kilometers, and I was like, that doesn't add up. Like I know I took a weird route across Japan, but I walked for way more than 2,000 kilometers. And as soon as I started watching the video series, I realized what had happened. He started like sort of close to where he was based for his YouTube channel, where he was living in Japan at the time, and
Uh,
that's basically at my halfway point was
right.
where he started.
So he didn't
Yeah,
start at the very tip and then make it all the way down. Like he didn't literally go from the very north to the very south. It cut
right.
off. Right, 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 right.
Yeah. And so as soon as I saw that, I was like, "Oh, I see what happened." And then the irony is, apparently, Sakai, like I must have walked through there because like the whole first stage of his journey coincided very nicely with my own. It was kind of fun because I was going back and forth for a while between like my blog posts of my experience of a place and Chris Broad's like video presentation of that place. And I think at the time he did the cycle, it was like 3 to 4 years after I did my walk. So it was still relatively close to what I remembered. And there were moments in the videos where I'd be like, I recognize that scenery.
Oh, that's awesome.
I know exactly where you are. It's so cool.
Just totally bring all the memories back for you. That's awesome.
Yep.
I'm glad you went back to find that. That's cool. Well, I think after because we've had quite a lot of because we had those two episodes talking about abroad in Japan, and then we had
Mm-hmm.
Desert Island Discs, and then I think even before then we had other slightly different, but it required prep. We had the UK and US cultural quizzes.
Yes.
So we've had quite a lot of podcasts which have been a little bit more uh, structured and with sort of homework, at least for one of
Mm-hmm.
us, in advance and things. So today's episode is going to be a little bit more off the cuff. Well, at least for me it is. Apparently, you've got um, a book of notes.
Yeah, well, the irony is, so Scout Sword and I have been talking on and off. If you're a regular listener, you'll know we've been talking about doing language learning as a topic for like 2 or 3 podcasts at least now, and it's been in the mix for even longer. And so we were both thinking, okay, we'll just do some anecdotes. And like as early as recently, that is, as yesterday, we were talking, and he was like, I don't know, I'm not going to have a big systematic thing to present. And I was like, yeah, well, neither am I. And he was like, you're a linguist and you're going to have like detailed thoughts. I was like, I really don't. And then I sat down this morning and I started writing, like thinking back to my experiences and what it was like. And I realized I created this list. I've got 2.5 pages of notes that are organized into like a tiered list structure where I've got like main points and sub points and branching. And I,
Uh,
I messaged him just before we started recording the podcast and was like, so I know I said I was just gonna be off the top of the head anecdotal sort of stuff, but apparently I've got some thoughts.
you see, when I used to be in group projects at school, I was normally the one who was diligent and did all the work while everyone else mucked around. Clearly, that theory's been put to the test with this relationship. I'm the one just winging it all the way. I mean, you are in terms of languages, you are definitely the more professional out of the two of us in terms of studies and work and stuff. So I'm not overly surprised by that. I did do a podcast probably around the same time last year where I talked about languages kind of, but it wasn't very structured. Maybe in the title it said language learning. I can't remember.
Hmm.
But so we might be revisiting a little bit of that topic. But obviously now we've got the additional insight with you, and then obviously a completely different language, and then we'll be able to think of some questions that we can go back and forth on. But
Yeah, I'm super interested to hear about like some differences between what it was like for me learning Japanese and what it's like for you learning Spanish. Because I imagine there are some really different aspects to that.
right. Well, we do a quick before we jump in. We'll do a very sort of quick summary, just in case anybody's tuning into this like fresh and don't know who who we are and what we're doing and all that sort of thing, or they didn't listen to the previous podcast.
Hmm.
So for me, yeah, I am nowadays predominantly a Spanish learner. When I was a kid at school, I learned French and German and a little bit of Russian,
Wow.
which normally raises eyebrows because it's quite rare, especially in Scotland, to have learned Russian. Um, but then, so yeah, in terms of how that all worked, it depends on what school you go to, but for most schools in Scotland, French is the compulsory foreign language you have to learn. Um, and then midway through, I got the opportunity to learn German, and um, I'm actually off. I've got some German heritage, and I had no interest in French at all. So I jumped at the chance to learn German, but unfortunately, I still had to keep going with the French. French was compulsory, even if you took German. So I ended up doing French and German. Whereas most students didn't do that because the idea of learning two languages sounded awful.
Hmm.
So I then once I was able to, I dropped French and kept going with German, and then for my final year, I did a little bit of Russian. Um, so that was interesting and new and different. And then, yeah, Spanish kicked in. How long ago now? Oh, let's try and work this out. 9 years ago? Oh goodness, that makes me feel quite old, and I can't believe that's almost
Hmm.
a decade ago that I started. But it has to be based upon where I was in my life and everything. Yeah, so I started Spanish 9 years ago, um, more or less. So yeah, the latter part of 2016. Yeah, that'd probably be right. It's around 8, 9 years ago. Started off learning in Edinburgh. For those of you who don't know, I'm living in Spain and I've got a Spanish wife. So that was the reason why all that. I mean, even though we speak in English, which again also um, interests people when I tell them
Hmm.
that we're living over in Spain, but we always talk to each other in English. And again, we can come onto that later if need be.
Hmm.
Um, but in order to talk to everybody else, then Spanish is necessary, especially the older generations of the family and the like. So, and I also can't go around assuming that people are going to speak English to me. So yeah, I started learning Spanish in Edinburgh, not even knowing I was going to potentially spend the rest of my life in Spain, or at least, for the next portion of my life, be living in Spain. Let's put it that way. So I started doing group classes. Uh, Took a wee break for a few months because I was a little bit sort of disillusioned with group class and didn't know if I wanted to carry on. Do I do private classes and then all cost, blah 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 blah. And then I did private classes, and then once I moved out here, I think I had maybe about 8 or 9 months where I didn't learn properly through a teacher, but I was living with my parents-in-law, so I was talking
Mm-hmm.
to them, and then definitely for the last, yeah, I'd say definitely for the last 4 years, I'm sure I've had a teacher for the last 4 years. I was learning both Spanish and Catalan at one point. Again, we can come around to that later on as well. But
Mm-hmm.
then after I think about 18 months of doing both, I then switched only to Spanish, and my level was just skyrocketed.
Yeah,
So
you've got some news to share on that front.
well, that's true. Yeah. So I say I'm gonna say recently, but it was in November, which is not exceedingly recently, but whatever. I did the B2 exam. So anyone doesn't know, there in Europe there is a language uh, classification system in terms of level. So it goes A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. So basically, native speakers are presumed to have close to C2 level. There'll be natives who don't have C2 level. When you leave high school, you normally have high C1 level. And A1's like zero, like very basic. So B2 is in that intermediate group, and B2 basically from, I don't know how it works with Spanish, but knowing it from the English, looking at what B2 English is, the student or the speaker, I guess, of the language should, in theory, have an understanding of all the necessary grammar to be able to express themselves in all situations. There will be niche grammar that they won't know, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
their fluency with the grammar might not be quite up to snuff, but in theory they know all the grammar necessary to communicate in whatever situation they want, and they have a wide enough vocabulary to be able to communicate about most familiar everyday situations, and then they're getting to the point where they might be able to express themselves about more complex ideas. C1 is where the maturity with the language really takes up a notch. Um, Niche grammar rules are learnt there, and then you're really adding a lot more vocabulary on
Mm-hmm.
top, and the maturity in terms of the type of topics you can then talk about increases. I will say, we'll come on to this later, but I have an disadvantage learning a language a little bit later in life in terms of I might not learn it at quite the same speed as a kid would, um, but
Mm-hmm.
being an adult, maturity to be able to talk about more experiences and like the wider world definitely helps. So yeah, that's the general gist. Yeah, I did the B2 exam in November, and I've just received news in the last few days that I've passed the exam. So I have
Hooray!
got B2 level, and I'm sitting here beside me with my C1 book. I was doing part of my homework assignment today, so I'm doing the C1 course. So in theory, each level takes 2 years to complete. That obviously depends on the speed of learning and the nature of the student and blah 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 blah. But in general, you normally take 2 years to get from one level to the next. But you could do it quicker. It just depends on what you're doing and how much language you're speaking outside of the class and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's me. Um, that's my general gist.
Cool. Yeah, so I had to choose between French or Spanish when I was in school, uh, rather than the compulsory French thing that you were talking about. I studied Spanish, and I think we had to make that choice initially in middle school, uh, which would have been like sixth grade. I want to make sure I don't like mess this up and give the Japanese here instead, but no, it would have been sixth grade. Um, and then in high school, I had the opportunity to switch to Japanese. Um, I think there was at least one year where I doubled up and I did both Spanish and Japanese, but I soon focused exclusively on Japanese, and I did that for the last 2 years of high school, and then I took off a year going to college because I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to focus on learning Japanese. But starting in my second year of college, I basically restarted my Japanese education because my high school years were not the best. We can get more into that a little bit in time. And from that point on, I just exclusively was studying Japanese through the rest of my college career. And then I went to live in Japan and got away from sort of formalized classes, but continued studying on my own. Went through a series of tests. I got so it's not quite as like standardized across the European Union or anything, but the sort of major test in the field of can you understand Japanese is the Japanese language proficiency test. And it sounds like the numbering scheme is basically the opposite as the European one because you start at like N5. They may have changed the system since I took it. And then you go N4, N3, N2, N1. And so after a few years of living in Japan, I took some courses like through correspondence. We had a class that they offered where they gave basically lessons in interpreting. So I took a class through correspondence, and there was one in-person seminar, which was incredible. And then after that, it was self-study for the N2 exam and then eventually the N1 exam. And from that point, I finished out my career. I had to keep studying because I wanted to be a translator, and now I'm working in the field. So I sort of hyper focused on Japanese. And then, of course, I think I've mentioned on the podcast in the past, I flirted very briefly with learning Old English and was not successful. So nowhere near as many attempts at languages as Scott Sword, but I, you know, I have my share of failed languages as well, or share of failed languages. Yeah.
So, yeah, I've only really got one major starting question. And
Okay.
again, I might, depending on how you want to structure this, I might be getting ahead of the conversation. But since we've mentioned in terms of languages that we learn, especially before the language that we're now specializing in, quote unquote, right?
hmm
Um, how can I phrase this nicely? What differences did you see in the experience between like your high school language learning experience and then your more recent adult or living in the field, kind of thing, like living in under the immersion of the language? Um,
Hmm. Well, high school is a little bit of a special case for me in the fact that I didn't have access to the class as it was actually being taught. So we did it through a distance learning program, which was sort of intriguing and sort of new technology at the time. So just for reference, you were talking about, wow, it's been 9 years. It's been 24 years since I started learning Japanese. So a little bit of a time difference there.
mhm.
Um, and at the time, the idea that you could video conference a class from the local community college and have that appear in the nearby, like high schools throughout the region, was like a totally new concept. Like, I don't think I was the first year that they did it, but it was fairly new. And so we had a monitor in the class who was meant to make sure that we were doing the work. And the actual class that was being taught was at the community college. And the community college schedule and the high school schedule did not line up at all. So it was a nightmare of an environment to try to learn a language in because all we were doing basically was watching badly recorded lectures that weren't addressing our needs specifically. They were just sort of general outlines. So we had those to reference, and then we were working out of the textbook as a group, like throughout the class, trying to get our own heads around the concepts. And
Right.
it was an utter recipe for disaster. I had, I like, I think I may have been the only person who learned anything in those 2 years of Japanese lessons. And even then, it was fair. What I took away from them was fairly basic. I didn't take away nothing, but it felt like I didn't go anywhere with it. Felt like I tried to learn the language and failed, and I basically restarted in college. Now, I actually think I want to underline this point, which is I don't think looking back that that time was wasted, that I really did restart. And I mean, I had this down in my little outline to bring up a little bit later, but if it's relevant, I can bring it back up again. I had this experience where when I was taking Japanese for the first time in college, which was my second year of college, um, I mentioned at the start of the class that I had taken 2 years of Japanese before, and I did great in that college class. Like I was acing all my tests, I was doing really well, and there was one test that I didn't study for, and it was about kanji, which was my weakness. It's still my weakness. I've gotten a lot better, obviously, because I need to be. Um, but that was definitely my weakness all through learning Japanese, as I'm not a very visual person, and so I had a very hard time learning kanji. And so it was a kanji test. I didn't study for it, and I totally bombed. And I went to go talk to the teacher about it, and she was like, "Oh, I was so happy when you failed that test." And I was like, "What?" She was like, "Because it shows me that you actually need to study." Like, I was worried that you were just breezing through the entire class based on prior knowledge. And this shows that, you're actually having to put in effort to learn in this beginner Japanese class, even though you've taken 2 years of Japanese in the past. And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's an interesting perspective." Um, but I think that, like, looking back, right, even though I wasn't boosted to the extent that that teacher was afraid that I was boosted by that initial class, I think I did have an easier time picking up the language, revisiting it even after a year, and even after the relatively bad education of those first 2 years. I had a relatively easier time picking it up than the other students in the class, and it was noticeable to the teacher.
Right.
So I thought that was interesting. And then if I was to contrast that with how I studied in Japan, uh, oh, it's very different. But maybe before I get there, do you have anything that you want to say on the subject? Like differentiated your like formal experience early on and later on at different stages?
Yeah, I'm thinking more for me in terms of because I'm not as far in as you are in terms of Spanish compared to your Japanese, but I'm thinking back to the high school languages that I learned and the model of teaching and the big weakness. I don't know what it was like for you learning Spanish and then also with the beginner Japanese classes, but then we'll maybe exclude that because it sounds like an absolute like an absolute circus of a situation trying to follow these classes via the screen and stuff. But the big issue with the languages, and I'm not in any way blaming the teachers here. I want to make that really clear. It's just the way the system is set up and how things are done and whatever. Um, you don't really learn the language. That's the problem.
Hmm.
It's such a um, it's almost like such a fake qualification. Say, oh yeah, you got this grade in this language. All it kind of proves that you can dedicate yourself to something and pass it.
Hmm.
But you can't. You know, what I mean, especially when you're in a class of. I mean, it's still the same in secondary school, right? When you're in a class of 30 kids, um, trying to make sure that everybody speaks is
Hmm.
people can easily hide or when you go into pairs you can easily muck around so you don't actually speak the language. um, the exams are such that you could absolutely fail the speaking but you could pick up points elsewhere and you'll still be fine. um,
Hmm.
at least how Scotland does it. Maybe they've changed it. I don't know, but when I did the reading and writing exams, you could sit there with a dictionary, so you didn't have to remember any of the words. You could just look up any words you wanted, and you'd be able to find as long as you can remember more or less how the grammar kind of stitches itself together and the conjugations and things. But that's not how you use a language in real life. That's just not
Right.
how it works, and you can't speak it. And I went to Germany for my Erasmus. For anyone who doesn't know that, Erasmus is a basically a why can't I speak today? Goodness me. a university. Well, it's initially for university students, but now it's expanded out for work and stuff. But the way I did it was at university, you could go abroad for a year, and the
Hmm.
Erasmus is that you can go to university abroad inside the European Union, and then it gets funded by the European Union and all that sort of stuff. So I went to Germany because why on earth would I go to Spain and spend time with my then girlfriend, now wife? I'm going to reconnect with my German roots, and I'll go to Germany, and then and I was doing research. I wasn't in classes. I was doing like research because I've got a scientific background. So I was doing scientific research in a lab for a whole year. This is just the dream to a kickstart my career hopefully, and then um, really bolster that language part of it.
Hmm.
Well, the scientific part didn't work because I am crap at synthetic chemistry. It turns out. So my experiments kept failing until the very end of the year. So that put
Wow.
me in a depressive spiral. And then the minute I walked into the lab, and the PhD student who was supervising me turned out to be Chinese, and I asked her, "Oh, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to speak in German or in English?" English, right?
Uh,
Because
yep.
obviously she could speak German. So yeah, that went great.
Wow. Uh,
Learn from your mistakes, people. Um, I don't like to regret things in life because I feel everything you do, even if it's a complete and utter car crash,
hmm.
you should always endeavor to find positive stuff that you can take from it.
Hmm.
But the amount of positives I can take out of that year are very minimal.
Hmm.
I must admit, it was not a happy period of my life, I mean, this podcast is, you know, designed initially to help mental health and stuff, and I'll admit I was deeply depressed during that period. Unfortunately, I didn't know I had depression because I didn't really understand what depression was, which I know sounds ridiculous, but it was only then after the fact I've looked back on that year with a lot of
Hmm.
reflection and thought, yeah, you weren't in a good place there, mate. I'm really glad I'm not there. I'm not still stuck there. So yeah, I know that's not about language learning, but I mean that obviously then really affects your ability to go out and immerse yourself with the world you're living in. But I discovered that even then, regardless of if I didn't speak German in the lab with the person who was supervising me in that, even just going out into the street and trying to talk to the cashier in the supermarket and stuff, I just suddenly realized I
Hmm.
can't do this.
Hmm.
I'm not in any way prepared for this.
Yeah.
So and it was really that's a huge disappointment to me. So I'm really
Hmm.
glad now I've got a language that I actually feel I can actually speak it.
Hmm.
It's a language I can actually use and not just read,
Yeah.
which is such a such a huge step up. And I don't know. It's the fact that I don't know how it worked with you in your Spanish classes, but a lot of it is just direct translation. They give you a vocabulary list of everything in English and then everything in the target language. So there you go, memorize that,
Yep.
um, without actually putting it into practice. If you are of a certain mindset where you are very driven and you'll practice, it works. But
Right.
the you that's not you don't learn by memorization. At least that's my opinion. Anyway, people might disagree with me, but I even had it. More recently, I something even more basic like the irregular past verbs in English. There's like this huge long list you can find online. It's like, well, yeah, you can study that, but in my opinion, you don't learn by memorization. You learn by using,
Hmm.
um, and you'll make tons of mistakes. But that's the point, because then you
Yeah.
will learn those mistakes. You'll learn from those mistakes, and you won't make them again. Um,
Yeah,
so yeah.
I will stick up a little bit for memorization. I feel like it works in more of a loop, right? If you do just straight memorization, this is the mistake that I actually made with Old English, is I had a very positive experience with memorizing kanji and vocab words late in my experience learning Japanese.
Hmm.
Tons of success, just drilling, 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 pure memorization. And it opened up so many aspects of the higher levels of that language for me. Sort of like you were saying earlier, that one of the big differences between the B2 and the C1 certification is vocab.
Hmm.
Uh, like just being able to build out my vocabulary and better understand the way that the kanji system fits together, the way that there are kanji within kanji, right? Like, and after you've learned the first maybe 1 to 200, you start seeing repeated elements, and they form a system. And it's easier once you see that system to learn to slot in new things to it. And so once that sort of engine gets going, once you put in enough of the memorization effort, you can then look around and apply that knowledge more easily in real life.
Right.
And
Right.
this is gonna come back again later, right? Where it's like if you just try and do pure memorization, I think you're pretty much doomed. Uh, if you just put yourself in the environment, I don't think that's enough either.
No, and I completely stand by
Yeah,
that too. I know of people
yeah,
who have. I mean, me going to Germany is a perfect example. I spent a whole year there. How much German did I
hmm
learn? Almost nothing,
yeah,
because partly because of circumstance and also motivation and various reasons. I didn't put myself in situations where you
hmm
learn, and I know other people who, and just because of my previous jobs and things, I've met people who have spent a year of their schooling in Ireland, for example, but they can't
hmm
speak a word of English. And then you get
yeah,
other people who go just for 2 weeks during the summer, and they come back full of new vocabulary. They've really absorbed it. So much of it is it's more attitude than aptitude. Aptitude's really important,
yeah,
but attitude's key.
hmm
If you don't have motivation, then and in discipline and the right mentality to go out there and test yourself and put yourself in uncomfortable situations, but forcing yourself to learn, you're never going to learn anything. It's
yeah.
yeah.
And I do feel like to sort of speak to your point about motivation, that sort of ties into what I was going to like go to for the difference between my college experience and my high school experience. Because in high school, I had some motivation, and circumstances were such that it didn't get me anywhere.
Hmm.
Well, not nowhere, right? Again, I don't want to discount my failures, right? Because even though I felt at the time like I tried to learn Japanese and failed, it actually did help me more than I probably gave it credit for later on. And so I do want to value that experience. But still, circumstances were such that despite really wanting to learn Japanese, I came away with relatively little and felt like I failed.
Mm.
But when I got to college, one of the big differences beyond just the fact that the classes were actually set up to work was that literally everybody there had to opt in. They were like, because the way that my college structured this class was, it was the first thing in the morning, and it was 5 days a week plus 1 day on the weekend.
Oh wow.
And yeah, so you were constantly being exposed to the language, constantly being asked to reinforce the skills, and you were with a small pool of people who all had to opt into that schedule among all the other various like college classes that they could have chosen to take.
Hmm.
So you were very clearly put in an environment where that sort of it selects for people who are motivated to learn, puts them all together, and like so, and even beyond the classes, right? They would be like, okay, we're going to have these classes 5 days a week, one study session on the weekends, and we want you to come to our language table for lunches where you can only speak in Japanese, and just have lunch with everybody speaking Japanese. And it was just this great way to sort of build this nest of immersion, even though it was within an otherwise English speaking environment,
Right.
which was very cool.
Hmm.
So that was college was sort of the point where the two things sort of really came together for me, where my motivation was met not just by a supportive class structure, but also by this system where they really wanted to get you not just memorizing things, because there was flashcard memorization and stuff going on in the classes, but also get that practical sort of usage based aspect out there and to emphasize that.
Hmm.
And I'm someone personally who like I'm super shy. And I don't like to put myself in uncomfortable situations. I don't like to be in situations where I feel like I can't communicate. I would go to those, Japanese language lunch tables and sit there and say maybe 3, 4 words the whole time. It's still building a skill to listen to everybody around you.
Right.
It's
Right.
still it's still reinforcing what you know,
Right.
right? So I think that was one of the like major steps in my ability to learn Japanese. And I give my Japanese teacher in college a lot of credit because I think she knew really well what she was doing when she put together those classes.
That's great. I think it's also I'm really um I'm really glad that you had like these sessions where even though you're all native English speakers, or as you most of you were all going and you were actively trying to communicate in Japanese because that's the big one of the
Mm-hmm.
big barriers. When you're in a class environment and you know that everybody else speaks the same native language as you, it's so easy that you don't talk to them in what we call, I don't know, I guess you'd call it the same, like L2, right? The target
Yeah.
language. It's just so easy that you'll start talking in L1. And it's like, oh
Mm-hmm.
no, you're missing the point here. You could just speak to each other in the target line. And obviously, if you're really basic like A1, then you're not going to be able to. But once you get to a
Mm-hmm.
certain point, you where you can speak a little bit of the target language, the more and more you can do that, the better. It's just too easy. That just you just slip into your native tongue, and then that's an opportunity sort of wasted in a way. Especially if you're not living in the country, then they are probably one of the very few group of people who you can actually speak the target language with. So it's a case
Mm-hmm.
of utilizing that as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Um,
So,
so yeah, for me, yeah, it's a real shame that I've those school sort of language learning experiences haven't built really kicked on and helped. I mean, I now looking back, I do regret not taking as much interest in French because I
mm-hmm.
did actually have a native French teacher, which is quite
Mm-hmm.
again quite rare, and he
Mm.
had good ideas in terms of what he was teaching us. But even though I could consider myself to be a studious person and I was a good student and I paid attention, I didn't cause trouble, I just wasn't interested.
Yeah.
So at that time it was just I was doing it because it was an obligation. If I could have dropped it, I would have
Mm-hmm.
dropped it. And in hindsight, I was like, oh damn, he was actually a good teacher, but I didn't fully take advantage of that situation. In in later life, I am going to go back to German,
Mm-hmm.
and I will make sure that I attack it with and not let what happened on my Erasmus to happen again. Um,
Good.
but I think then, yeah, picking up Spanish was very, especially the fact they had that objective. It wasn't just for me, but it was also, well, if I'm gonna talk to my, this because obviously at this point we weren't yet married, but it was clearly obvious that the relationship was gonna last. And
Mm-hmm.
for people who don't know, my wife and I had a distance relationship for 6 years, or long distance relationship for 6 years. So there's always a lot of doubt with that type of relationship. Is it what is exactly going to happen? Where's this leading? But once it's getting
Mm-hmm.
to that point, it's like, well, it looks like this is going to definitely last. If I'm gonna be seeing the in-laws more often, I'm gonna have to talk to them. I'll also just do something different because I was really focusing on some very tough studies at that point. I just started a doctorate, so
Mm.
probably more studying was probably not the thing for me. I should have done, but it was nice just to be able to disconnect from that completely, but also do something productive.
Yeah.
So is
Well,
it?
they've done studies where they found that if you switch subjects, like your brain gets fatigued of the same subject too long in a row.
Hmm,
And so if you're able to then switch gears and then essentially if you can switch back and forth from subject to subject to subject and cycle it, you learn more effectively than if you just try and learn one thing continuously the entire time.
hmm.
So I think it makes total sense that, like, okay, I'm going to use this part of my brain when I'm studying for my doctorate. Okay, I'm going to turn that off for a little bit. I'm going to go and learn some Spanish. And then you can come back. And even though you've been studying, in both cases,
Was that a dramatic pause?
did I cut out on my back?
Yep. You said even though you've been studying, and then it just went silent. I was like, oh, he's really hyping up for something, and then it just never
Oh,
came.
no. No, I was talking the whole time. It's the mysterious dropped audio.
We'll leave that in. That'll be funny for the listeners. Anyway, so yeah, even though you've been studying,
Even though you've been studying the whole time, you're able to refresh your brain,
hmm,
right? Because you've switched what you're actually studying with what.
right. I think also like the thing in particular. I mean, not that I'm saying anything else would not be, wouldn't be valid, but the fact a doctorate is very, it becomes an obsession. It becomes as all encompassing, not encompassing, like it takes over your life. So being able just to disconnect us a little bit and do something else, and also doing it from scratch, and it was fun because we did. It was in a beginner class, and it was a group, and we were all different ages. We all had different objectives. Oh, right, my girlfriend's Spanish. Oh, what about you? Oh, I want to go and travel in Venezuela. Oh, what about you? Right? It was a nice mix.
Hmm.
So I did 3 levels of that, but the groups kept changing, so there weren't many students who were the same for some reason. I just ended up getting a little bit tired of the group classes because I'm a bit of a. I know this can sound awful, but I find it really difficult waiting for other people, especially when I want to
Hmm.
learn. And there is a lot. I'm going to say this now. There's a lot to be gained by listening to other people.
Hmm.
There were definitely some classes in there where there was other students in the class who definitely knew more than me, even though we were doing the same level. And I was very much listening to them and trying to see
Hmm.
what they were talking about. So I'm not saying it is a waste of time. It isn't. Um, if you can get yourself alongside and partnered up with somebody else who is also a good student or maybe knows more than you can definitely utilize that to your advantage and learn from them, which is great. But then when you have the opposite and you have somebody in the class who is maybe not at the same speed, it can be a very frustrating sort of experience, and you don't go as quickly because obviously the teacher has to go around everybody, right?
Hmm.
So once I did 3 of these classes and I got through them all, I was thinking, right, do I want to keep doing group? Do I want to do private? Oh, but private costs X times as much as group, of course.
Hmm.
So that was a consideration. And then eventually, after about I can't remember how long, maybe it was a 6 or 9 month break. I can't remember. I went back to the same academy in Edinburgh, but I started doing private. And I think I did that for about a year.
Hmm.
I can't remember now. That'll probably be about right. Yeah, about a year, 18 months before then, suddenly I packed my bags and came over here. Um, yeah, and that I prefer the private environment. It is obviously a more expensive route to go, but if you want to be selfish, then you just learn more. You have more interaction time with the teacher. You have more time speaking. You have more time reading.
Hmm.
You just accelerate that process, which is which is very useful and definitely helped me out a lot. Um,
Yeah.
so
And I will say, like, sort of.
dun dun dun. All right, we're gonna pause this time until poor Rook can work out whatever's going on. That also give me time to get some tea. All right, I think we're back. Let's
Hopefully.
hopefully you carry on with your train of thought before you lose it.
Right. Okay. So I was just gonna say, like, sort of the crux of my like argument, quote unquote, that I was, busily constructing this morning was that language learning is a very personal process,
Yep.
and it makes sense that different people will learn at different speeds, right? And so having the ability to get someone who can advise you at your own personal pace, like that makes sense that that's a huge advantage, right?
Hmm.
At the same time, I do think there are some advantages to the group setting, even if you have people who are at a lower level than you or are struggling, in the sense that sometimes that can offer you opportunities to help teach them, and that's the best way to learn, because you have to really know your stuff in order to teach it to someone else.
Hmm.
So there is that, and then there's also the phenomenon. I don't know how much you've had this, Scott Stewart, but there's the phenomenon of people who are in a class and maybe 50% of the students don't know what's going on, but only one of them has the courage to raise their hand and
Right.
say, I can't follow it. Yeah, else is just silently grateful that this one person's willing to look like an idiot.
I think it's different. I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to think that maybe adults would be less likely to be ashamed of asking.
Maybe.
Um, I'm not. Maybe teenagers are more self-conscious about it. I
Mm.
get again. It maybe depends on the person. Um, I guess adults will have a little bit more of I don't know, or maybe it just depends on the group. Depending on what group it is, they might have a bit more of an inclination to sort of look at each other and kind of go, are you getting this or not? And if suddenly there's
Hmm.
a clear consensus within that tiny group at maybe one part of the class that they're not getting it, they'll have more confidence to go, right, teacher, we're not getting this. I think the other thing, I mean, again, this is going to be a very petty reason to say why
Hmm.
I don't like group classes, but I'm going to have a little bit of a, not a rant, but I'm going to stereotype here a little bit, and I'm sorry for this, but there is a problem with. Let me explain the situation. Then I'll try and. I was going to slag off all British people there, or not all British people, but
Oh,
stereotype, which is probably not a good idea. um, the okay, so the thing that bugged me a bit was um when I did the very first beginner one Spanish classes. One of the very first things they did with us is they sat us down and they taught us the alphabet
hmm.
and like phonetically, because fortunately, compared to English, which is an absolute, pardon the French, but shit show for language in
Hmm.
terms of like phonetics and all this sort of stuff and trying to be consistent with pronunciation for different letter groupings or whatever. Spanish is very friendly in this sense. It's unfriendly in lots of things, but it's very friendly in terms of pronunciation. Every time you see the letter A, it's pronounced the same way, so you don't have to
Hmm.
guess pronunciation. So they taught us the alphabet really early. And my teacher said,
Hmm.
and the teacher said to us, right, now you know the alphabet, you can theoretically pronounce any single word, and even if you don't know what it means, you can read it out loud.
Hmm.
And then the issue was then when I was going into later group classes, because there was obviously like a mixture of people who'd done that first class, who hadn't done that first class, or whatever, and you end up with then students who'd obviously somehow skipped that lesson or slipped through the net or whatever, and then they were not doing it correctly, and there's just that thing, and I didn't want to get into bad habits, and I don't know if anybody gets this, but I was cringing listening to
Hmm.
some people trying to speak Spanish, and I'm saying this now. I am not perfect. I make mistakes all the time, but I endeavor to do it correctly. And I don't want to bumble through it thinking, oh yeah, everything's fine. Ignorance is bliss, right? And hearing the the British way of pronouncing Spanish words when you don't know how Spanish, phonetics works in terms of at least the basic pronunciation makes my skin crawl so badly.
Oh, wow.
and and I'm just like, I can't take this anymore. Um, and yeah, yeah, yeah. That was one of the main things that made me stop doing,
Hmm.
because at least if I went one on one, as I know the teacher is native, so they're going to
Hmm.
pronounce things correctly, hopefully, unless they're from the south of Spain. Sorry, people from the south of Spain.
Whoa.
I'm sure you're lovely people. I've never been, and I'm sure the regions are beautiful. But oh my god, I have a really hard time understanding you. I'm really sorry. Um, People from the north of Spain will agree with me, by the way. This is not a
I
controversial
believe it.
opinion. Um, but yeah, and I'm saying I'm not perfect. I make mistakes, and I don't. And when I speak, it's obvious I'm British. I don't have a Spanish accent, but I really endeavour to do it correctly, and it really bugs me when people don't do it.
Yeah.
It's really sad to me. Obviously, but then somebody else could come along and say to me, "Oh well, it bugs me that you don't try to speak with a proper accent. You still got your British underlying accent still there." Um, but again, that just depends on where you are on the in terms of the knowledge scale and also what you deem as acceptable and things. But it made my skin crawl, and I was like, I cannot listen to this anymore. I have to I have to find some other way around this problem. Obviously, hopefully, as the higher up you go, then the that problem will be eliminated a little bit. But still, it's
Yeah. Hopefully.
I was going to ask you that when you speak in because I don't know because I just hear you and I don't know when you speak Japanese, do you have like an authentic Japanese accent, or is there
I
still
don't.
this underlying American tone to your voice?
I think you could still like identify me as a foreigner, especially now because I'm less in practice actually using the language compared to what it was like when I was living in Japan.
Hmm.
But having said that, I have been told that my Japanese pronunciation is like surprisingly good, and it's a little bit difficult to know how well to trust that because Japanese people are famous for if you just say hello or if you say konnichiwa, which is not good pronunciation by the way. But if you walk up to a Japanese person and say, "Hey, konnichiwa," they'll be like, "Oh, you know Japanese. That's awesome."
Uh, I think
Sort of bit of a joke among the people who live in Japan is Nihongo Jozu, which just means your Japanese is so good because that's like literally any Japanese anyone says. Like a Japanese speaker will tell you how great your language ability is, and
oh,
so they're really not they're really not worth like a strong opinion, right? Like sometimes you can tell the way they say it, right? They're like, "Oh, you have really good Japanese," right? Like, and in that case, it's like, okay, yeah, you actually think that. But a lot of the time, it's like, is this just the standard Nihongo Jozu?
mm. I've had it too, where I've had some people say to me, "Oh, your Spanish is really good," and I don't, I'm sure they're being sincere, but I don't know if they're doing it just out of pure politeness or if they
Hmm.
genuinely mean it. But I've had enough people say it to me that I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is genuine. Maybe I do actually speak quite well.
Yeah.
But it,
There was one phone call that I made to a guy who I think was racist, who initially mistook me as a Japanese person. And so I feel like at that point, that was a bit of an endorsement.
oh wait, is that's the like the in guy, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
I love that story.
I've told this story before. I was calling ahead and I was like, "Hey, I'd like to stay at your Japanese style inn." And we got through the entire conversation. He was like, "Yeah, come on in. You know, we've got a room. It'll be this much, this, that, the other thing." And the only thing I didn't do right was I didn't know when to hang up. And so I sort of stayed on the line a little bit too long. And the guy was like, "Where are you from?" And I told him, "Oh, well, I'm walking Japan, but I'm originally from the States." And he said, "Oh, don't come here. You can't stay here. There's tatami all over the rooms." And I was like, "I've stayed in Japanese inns before. I like tatami. I think it'll be fine." And he was like, "Go to the business hotel."
Damn. You think
So
that you know what, you know the reason why he must have like had the scales must have been falling from his eyes a little bit and suddenly realizing that, oh no, not all these foreigners are bad, some of them do actually try to integrate with our culture, and that was that the realization is in his brain that that was happening, but he couldn't he couldn't tell himself that, so he had to put you down and send you off to the business hotel.
yeah, I don't know. Like there is a certain extent to which Japanese people think, "Oh, foreigner, this person's going to be a hassle to deal with. I don't want to deal with it." It's not necessarily racist. It's just they don't know the norms of this culture, and I don't want to deal with someone who is going to be extra work for me, right? So it's not a 100% solid like guarantee that this particular person was racist, but it certainly like gave me a negative impression of him and his Japanese style inn. I think I told the story before too. I was really hoping that I'd call the business hotel and be like, "Sorry, we're booked full," and I could show up at the guy's door and be like, "Hey, buddy, guess what? I know you've got a room because you sold one to me until you decided that I was going to get like forced onto the business hotel." But it's probably for the best that that didn't happen.
Especially for a country like Japan, which has a culture that is so unique.
Hmm.
It's not like Europe, where even though yes, there's such a variety of languages and there is different culture, of course there is still a sense of normality between the different nationalities. It's not wildly different. There are culture shocks, which we talked about before, but nothing so extreme that you wouldn't know how tatami would work or something like that. It's
Hmm.
so yeah. Um, so yeah, that was a slight tangent on my part, but yeah, it's just it's something that I've really tried to take seriously. Like I'm one of these people where if I do something, I want to try to do it 100%. Um,
Hmm.
and especially it's a language, you want to try and respect it. And I I don't want people to look at me. I don't. I'm not offended if they look at me and go, "Oh, he's clearly British," but in the sense of they view it negatively. I want them to
Hmm.
be like more. Oh yeah, we can tell he's British, but he's clearly trying and he's clearly treating the language with respect and all this sort of thing, rather than just with pure ignorance slash a little bit of arrogance thrown in, just walking around and throwing out Spanish words with random pronunciation every time and just hoping that the daters will understand you, kind of thing. Because that's
Yeah.
unfortunately, I don't know what's like in the States, but unfortunately, British people in general, again, I am stereotyping slightly, but there's this reputation that we have that we are terrible at learning languages. All the rest of the world learn English, so why should we bother learning their language? Kind of attitude,
Yeah.
and
The people from the US have the same sort of stereotype to deal with.
um, it's something that I'm gonna come up with later. But I'm actually getting rather annoyed about the level of English that is now invading day-to-day Spanish life.
Oh,
Um,
that's funny.
I'm actually really against it.
Oh, that's so funny.
I'm gonna be the one person like dying on the hill of protect the Spanish language.
Oh, that's really funny.
um, yeah, it's something I don't know if we want to talk about that now, if we want to transition to something else, but first, but yeah, it's I've noticed it now. There's a lot of, and I was going to ask you the same about Japanese actually. Right, there's a lot of what they call in Spanish. I think it's préstamos, like loan words, words which are
Hmm.
taken from one language and used in another. And I know in many languages, especially within Europe and close proximity, it makes sense that loan words exist.
Hmm.
Because of mixing of cultures a long time. Like English is full of French loan words, or
Oh
ones
yeah.
which have been slightly adapted. Like music is a perfect example. That's not an English
Hmm.
word. That's clearly a French word, right? And it's just been the spelling's been adapted over time. But especially nowadays, there's a lot more modern usage of loan words coming from the internet and
Yeah.
media and all this sort of thing. But it's become almost like a thing now here where uh, a lot of average, like small regional businesses seem to think they have to use English as some sort of advertisement or marketing strategy.
Ah.
And it really pisses me off to no end. And it just does my head in, and just then, I mean, often I do this almost like as a comedy routine when I teach. Uh, Loan words which are taken from English and used in Spanish, but they're used incorrectly. So then, when students then try to reverse it back into English, like so, a nice easy one. I know this is a slightly different topic, but a nice easy one would be the word camping,
Hmm.
right? I don't know about you, but for me, camping's the activity. Um,
Yes.
but un camping in Spanish is the place.
Oh, weird.
Um, and the number of times I'll
Not,
just
not like an encampment, but a camping.
yeah, literally on camping. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
camping? No. Camping site? No. Campsite? No, no, on camping. I'm like, oh, very good. So what's the activity then? And I'll just show a picture of a campsite. I'll say, what's that? And they'll go, oh, on camping. It's a camping. No, doesn't exist. Same, like, now I've started doing it, and I've got to try and break this habit because I'm very lazy, but a car park, right? Un parking.
Hmm. Oh, yep.
Oh, a footing.
At least that one's close to the English parking lot.
Up at British English doesn't say, we don't say that. We say car
I
park,
know. I know that is very different from British English.
which is
I
even
wanted to
more,
say.
which is why more I'm fighting against it.
Yeah.
um, Footing. I'm going to blame the French
Ooh.
for that one because they do that as well. Um,
Well, that's also American English. It probably doesn't mean what
Excuse me?
the Spanish usage is, but if you're talking about find your footing.
Oh no, that's fine. No, that's okay. I've got yeah, that's the same in British English. Like you find your you stabilize a situation and you try to understand what's going on. Yeah, find your footing in something. Yeah. No. Footing, running.
Oh, I see.
I'm just I
I knew it would be.
every time I
I
hear a
knew the
Spanish,
usage. Sorry, I knew the usage would be wrong. I just didn't realize how wrong.
I just stare and just go. Firstly, I'm annoyed because you've taken an English word and just shoved ing onto the end of it without even thinking about the meaning. Second, you have a word in Spanish for running. It's correr. Why can't you just say that?
Yeah.
No, because it's like running, but only a little bit. Okay, imaginary Spanish person that I'm talking to. You could use an English word. There is an English word. Jogging. There you go.
Hmm.
You like ing things. Everything is ing at the moment. Everything has ing. Marketing.
uh,
Well, meeting. I've now discovered that meeting is a thing, but it's spelled
oh
differently.
wow.
I'm just like, oh my goodness, can you just stop using these
Uh,
words? Oh, this one you'll love. I'm getting riled up just thinking about it. So this one was really interesting to me because I was speaking with my parents-in-law,
hmm.
and they use this phrase. Now, let me just. I won't say too much about my parents-in-law, but they can't speak English. Okay,
Hmm.
my mother-in-law speaks zero because she never
Hmm.
learnt it. Not her fault. Different time, different generation.
Hmm.
Um, my father-in-law did learn some, but obviously hasn't had to use it because, again, the way that he entered the work, even though he's had quite a good job and things, the world was such and his work environment was such that he didn't have to use it. It's not like now. If he did that same profession, but nowadays he would have to know English. There'd be no
Hmm.
question. But because of his generation, he didn't need to know it. So he can speak a little bit. He often he often jokes to people, and he says, because obviously I in the early days I practiced a lot of Spanish with him, having late
Hmm.
night conversations, and he always says to people very proudly, "I sacrifice my English for his Spanish." It's like very good. um, but they were just talking, and then they said this phrase, and they said "de alto standing," and I was only
Okay.
half listening, and my brain just kind of went into a mush and went, "Hang a minute, did they just speak English? Did they say the word outstanding?" And I
Hmm.
kind of looked at them and went, "What did you just say to me?" And they were like, "Oh no, este piso, este alto standing." And like, what do you mean de alto standing? And what they've done, this expression does mean outstanding, of high quality. But what they've done is taken the expression like high standard in English, translate it
Hmm.
literally alto high. We don't like this. We don't like the
Ah.
standard bit. I will chuck that away. That doesn't sound very good. Oh, there's a word there with ing. Outstanding. All right, well, let's just squish those two bits together. De alto standing. I almost flipped my
Wow.
lid once I discovered what they were saying. Oh my goodness. And that probably is
Uh,
now some of my wife's friends know I hate it and they use it with
yeah.
me at every opportunity.
Yeah, they'll do it all the time. It's funny.
The
Uh,
the worst one, I'm just gonna say this as the one that's really riled me up is I've seen them kind of here in bits and maybe with advertisements online or something. I think it's a driving school. I hope it's a driving school. Otherwise, they've used it for completely the wrong meaning. Um, the language school. Oh, what an idiot. The driving school is just called Driver.
oh,
But
I thought you were gonna say driving.
no, well that you see that would have been better. That would have been better because it's all ing and it's all cool and sexy, right? Because it's English. But
Right.
what they've done is they have done it instead of using the V, they've used a B. Now,
Oh no.
in Spanish, if anyone does, I mean, you would know because you know from Spanish, right? The letter B and the letter V in Spanish, even though they have different names, be and ube, they're pronounced the same. So if you have B in the word, like in Barcelona, it's a B
Hmm.
sound, and then if you have something with a V, it's pronounced the same. I think grape is Uber. Now I'm now forgetting if that thing is a thing, right? But anyway, or I live Bibo. You don't know if it's a
Okay.
V or a B until you see it written, right? They're pronounced the same.
Hmm.
So what they've done is they've taken the word driver from English, but then they've changed the V for a B. So me reading it as my English brain, it says driver, which means nothing.
Yeah.
It riles me up every time. And just it seems like now there's too much English about, and it drives me nuts. When Spanish is such a rich language, and
Hmm.
okay, in the European continent, it's got competition because you've got France and Germany and Italy and Poland and and Russian and you've got a lot of different languages of a similar sort of population scale and whatever. But there's a whole continent more or less on the other side of the Atlantic. You know, you've got so many countries that speak Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
with the exception of then Brazil and things. But you know what I mean? It's just it's such a it's such a powerful language. You don't have
Mm-hmm.
to. If it's a country that's much smaller with a very small population base and internationally it's not used very much, I understand that maybe there'll be a bit more of it creeping in, but
Mm-hmm.
Spanish doesn't need it. I don't know. It drives me nuts.
Clearly.
I know it's not. It's got and it's like Pandora's box. We've opened it now. It's gonna keep going in that way. But
Yeah.
as a native English speaker, you'd think I'd be happy that English is becoming more used.
Mm-hmm.
Is becoming more prevalent, but I actually don't.
Mm-hmm.
Things get used out of context. They're being used for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
When a phrase would be perfectly, if you're a huge, international conglomerate or something, I
Mm-hmm.
fully appreciate that. Then your slogan, your tagline, even if you're a Spanish company, your tagline would be in English because you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
promote it outside of the country and give this sense of globalization and internationalism and all that stuff. Totally get it. But if you're a
Mm-hmm.
relatively small company who doesn't really do much trade outside of the country, you don't need to do it. You don't need to look cool by using English and then getting it wrong, probably. Just
Mm-hmm.
stick to the Spanish. It's fine.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant. What's the
It's fun
situation?
though. It's engaging. Like in Japan, they do the same thing, right? They English is cool, and so they just borrow words and they'll throw them around and they'll like put them into the Japanese pronunciation, right? The I think I've talked before about the katakana filter, where sometimes you look at something and you're like, how did you get this from that, right? Because Japanese sort of like Spanish, right? The way that they represent sounds, like that sound is always that sound. If you see a written out a in a Roman script, it's always going to be ah, right?
Hmm.
Um, and usually they don't write with our alphabet anyway. They write in hiragana for like native Japanese words and kanji, mixture of those for native Japanese words, and then they'll write in katakana for foreign loan words. Um, and the way that the katakana works is it's sort of like this filter because that's all the pronunciation that they like really know and are comfortable with. So they tend to add in a lot of extra vowels and things where you wouldn't necessarily expect them, and you sort of have to know where to discount them. And they have the same thing where B and V are pretty much the same. I think I may have used this example in the past, but like I remember I went to Baskin Robbins, which in Japan is just 31 ice, which there you go. Ice is ice cream in Japanese.
Oh,
Um, yep. I went to Sati One and I got my Betty Betty strawberry.
oh yes. Yeah, you have talked about that one before.
Yeah, which is very berry strawberry. But of course, the V and the B are both the same, and so you don't get the like play on the pronunciation that happens in English. You
Right.
just repeat the same sound.
Hmm.
So, yeah. Um, and like there's also like it's not just so in Japan you've got that level, right, where they've got katakana stuff. They've also got like their own words that they've come up with based off of their understanding of English, which is often very bad. um I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, and it's nothing's coming to me. But the one example that did spring to mind that I'm sort of getting to is this additional category where because a lot of people in Japan have had some level of English education at this point, even though they're not necessarily like adept at using the language, they can sort of use it,
Hmm.
and to a native speaker, like it doesn't really make sense. But if it's like they know just enough to be like opaque to a native English speaker, but will communicate to a Japanese speaker. So the thing that I have in my head as an example is this slogan of this like major electronics chain that I used to go to when I was like looking to set up my apartment or when I wanted to buy DVDs or something in Japan. Which I walk in the store and they have this big thing that says "For your just." So does
What?
that make a lot of sense to you?
For your just?
Yep, exactly.
I thought there's gonna be another word.
And
I thought there's gonna be another word coming, and then you just
no,
stopped. I was like,
I just stopped because
just what?
yeah, and they just is in quotation marks. And
Okay.
and it's from the like it's from the idea in Japanese of chodoi, which is like just right. So the phrase that they're actually looking for is just right for you. But
Ah,
they don't put it that way in the Japanese slogan because they just have like taken the like understanding of English that someone at that company remembered from middle school. I don't. This probably isn't actually how it happened, and they put it like in front of the store as like their little slogan, and I was just like, what is that even supposed to mean? And then I like looked over at the Japanese, and I was like, oh, now I get it.
you
I
you
know exactly I know exactly where they went wrong. And it's too much of that reliance on like dictionary literal translation type thing, right? If you look
right.
up each individual part of that word from Japanese to English, it makes sense. But if you actually put those together in English, it's just like that means nothing. What
Right.
do you mean for your just?
So anybody who's tried to translate your company slogans or whatever into, say, English as an example, if a native English speaker understands the original language better, you know you're not on a winner. There's clearly, yeah, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
I've not seen that with.
I will say,
Oh, sorry, on you go.
go ahead.
I
Okay.
haven't seen it with company slogans, but menus have got me. And you can always
Uh
tell menus that haven't been professionally translated, and just some of this. I mean, I wish I had examples to tell you, but some of the stuff I've seen, and even like
mm,
the translation of like information tourist boards, right? Tourist information boards when you go into a village and it tells you about the village or about this monument or whatever. And I always look at the English, and if it's a good translation, then I'm happy. If it's not, I have a really good chuckle to myself. Because some of the
yeah.
things they come up with, it's just like, oh, why? Menus are worse because there's so many plates that you cannot translate literally because they don't make any
Right.
sense. And I think people just translate without thinking. Like it can be anything. I mean, I know this is an English thing, but like I can't remember if we did this in the quiz or not. But like toad in the hole,
Hmm.
even to a native English speaker, that doesn't mean. Unless you're British, I don't think that makes it. Does that make any sense to you?
No.
Right.
I
That's.
think ironically, I think it was even on the
I
quiz,
think it
but
was
yeah.
in the quiz, right? But that makes no sense. So then, if you try to translate that literally, that makes even less sense. So the only way you could describe things for menus, you have to literally describe the ingredients and the way it's cooked, not the name. But I've seen people
Yeah.
try to translate menu items, and I've read it in English and just gone, I don't even know what that is in English.
Yeah.
It makes zero sense.
I will say, as a translator, menu items are a real challenge.
Yeah.
I've had to do it a handful of times. It's so hard. It's it's a real challenge because there's, as you say, like some stuff you just can't translate, and it's like, okay. I remember there was this one restaurant that me and a friend went to in Japan, and they saw that we were foreigners, and they do a lot of business with people who are English, and so they gave us an English menu, and we were looking down at all the stuff that was translated, and we were like, okay, we don't know what this is in English. Can you give us the Japanese menu? And they gave us the Japanese menu and be like, oh, okay, I see what this is, right?
Especially if you start going a little bit more upmarket, where then the ingredients start becoming a little bit unusual, let's say, or
Yeah.
certain cuts of meat or whatever. I mean, I had it when my wife and I got married here, not in the UK. So what we did was we chose the menu that we wanted at the venue, and they said, right, we're gonna then they're gonna print the menus in Catalan.
Hmm.
And I said, well, that's going to be useless to all my friends coming over. Can we get an English translation? And they kind of said, well, you'll have to do it. I was like, that's fine. I'll happily sit there in front of Google Translate, try to work it out. But I was being really careful in trying to not just blindly translate and actually think about, does that make sense
Hmm.
in my native tongue. I think it helps I was translating into my native tongue, not into a language.
Oh yeah.
If I was translating the other way, it would have been a disaster. So that's the
Oh
thing.
yeah.
I think you can only use translating tools like that if you're translating into your native tongue, because you can correct for the mistakes, but you can't correct it going the other way. And there was certain
Yeah.
things I was looking on the menu in Catalan, and I was turning to my wife, who's obviously a native speaker of Catalan, and going, "What's that?" And she'd be like, "I have no idea. I've never heard of that." It'd be some random cut of meat or something, right?
Right.
It can get really tricky.
Hmm.
So yeah, don't do that, people. Don't Google Translate your menus, especially when you're doing it. Or get it checked by a professional. It doesn't hurt.
Exactly. Yeah. Uh, but yeah, it's one of those things where, like, even if you know what you're doing, right? Sometimes there's multiple options, and you can be like, okay, do I want to? What sort of place is this, right? So just as an example, tonkatsu is a type of Japanese food, and it's considered actually a foreign dish. It's you can translate it as breaded pork cutlet, and that's sort of literally what it is. They take pork and they fry it with panko, like
Hmm.
breadcrumb style flakes, stuff like that. It's delicious. Um, and it's a very specific dish. They always cut it in a certain way. It's usually served with cabbage and tomatoes. And it's like, okay, do I translate this as tonkatsu? Do I translate this as pork katsu? Do I translate this as pork cutlet? Because katsu is just
Uh,
like the tone in tonkatsu means pork, and the katsu is the way that it's fried. So you can sort of recombine that and make it, fried pork if you want to, right? And there's different levels, and I think, quite frankly, depending on what style you're going for with your restaurant, there's multiple right options. This is the thing with always with translation.
mm,
There's usually multiple right options. And then the question is which one's best for your particular circumstance. And so I've been to restaurants that are like, we're Japanese restaurants in the United States, and they'll translate the same thing several different ways, right? I've been to some places that like we have pork katsu because in addition to the tonkatsu, which is for the pork, they'll also have like vegetables, right?
mm,
Or they'll have this other, and it's all fried the same way. And so they'll say, we've got pork katsu, we've got chicken katsu, we've got, vegetable katsu. And it's like, okay, that's going to tell people what they need to know, and that'll be fine. But do you really spell it out and say breaded pork cutlet, right? And
mm.
then you get into things like sushi, which everybody knows what that is now, but they just took the Japanese word and transliterated it. So there are some dishes where you have to do that, right? It's a really interesting subject, but you're talking to a translator, so of course I would say that.
Um, I was going to ask in terms of, I mean, 'cause I can definitely, I know it for me. Maybe there's more difficult stuff that I haven't reached yet. And also, I mean, we'll talk about the positive, like the not the easy stuff, but also the more satisfying things as well. But um, was that initial step in terms of learning all the kanji like the most difficult thing you've come up against in terms of learning Japanese, or was there something else in particular that was a real hurdle or obstacle that was quite a challenge to get past?
For me, the biggest hurdle was definitely the kanji. 100%. Like that was the biggest stumbling block for me, and it's still one of my weakest areas. So there's just there's just no huge way around it. You've got to, like, at the end of the day, there's the system that I talked about, and you can sort of start to see the system, and that will help you learn them, and you can get better with use, and you can practice like with flashcards and things. But at the end of the day, you sort of just need to learn over 2,000 of these characters. And the interesting thing about Japanese is that is a barrier. Like, first of all, some people, like I have people who are very like visually oriented. Kanji is the easiest thing for them, and they really struggle with listening. And for me, I've been watching anime and, like, exposed to Japanese media for even longer than I was trying to learn the language. And so, like, listening for me is relatively easy. And it's like, okay, it's this obscure kanji that I don't know. Like, that'll throw me down a rabbit hole for hours, right? It'll shut me down real quick. Whereas some of my friends are like, oh yeah, like if it's like written kanji, like I'll recognize all these things, I can figure it out, and blah 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 blah. Or they just happen to know they've been studying kanji a lot because they love kanji. And I don't study kanji because I love kanji. I study kanji because I needed to in order to get to, the right level of language comprehension. And I kept doing it over and over and over again, right? It was hard to get it to stick in my brain. So yeah, that was absolutely the biggest hurdle for me. Some people don't have that hurdle. or it's a different size. And then some people, right, if you're coming from Chinese, right, if you're coming, depending on where you are in the world, maybe you already know all of those Japanese kanji or something very similar to them because they don't line up one to one. There are some kanji that are unique to Japan. There are some kanji that are used in Japanese in ways that they are not in, say, Chinese. And that can throw off people who are more familiar with those languages. So it's not like there's nothing they have to adjust to, but they're adjusting their existing language base as opposed to like picking it all up from scratch.
Hmm.
So I think it's that's one of the interesting things about Japanese as a language is that yeah, it uses kanji, but it uses them in its own way, and depending on which sort of direction you're coming from in learning the language, your experience of dealing with them will be very different.
Right. Interesting. Okay, I definitely agree in terms of the point you said that everyone's good. Languages are very personal, and the whole learning process is
Hmm.
personal, and everyone's gonna have their own strengths and weaknesses. It was kind of I found quite shocking when I was reading that book, Abroad in Japan, where Chris Broad was saying quite early on that before he would go to school every day, he'd sit down and get through X number of kanji every day to try and get them, and over the course of several weeks or months, he was able to get through that initial sort of 2000. Um,
Hmm.
so okay,
Yeah. For me, it was a struggle for years. That was always the part where, even though, like I said, I think I had a pretty good Japanese class, like I would have to study before each kanji test for that test. And then what was my retention rate? Like probably close to zero. I ultimately, it was when I lived in Japan and I bought this set of flashcards that I finally got the kanji down.
hmm.
And like it took a high level of repetition. So I actually think this is a pretty good way to like sort of segue into my little argument because first of all, some of the like supporting things that I like put in, well, I say supporting, they're their own points, but I had them as sort of supporting points for my argument. We've already touched on, so we can just sort of blow through the stuff that's review. So my initial point is very basic, but I think it's easy to underestimate, which is learning a language is an endurance event
Yes.
and it's never really over. Like it sort of depends, and this is going to tie back in later. It sort of depends what your goal is, what you want to get out of the language. But if you're like me and you want to make a living, like knowing a language, you're always going to be learning new things, right? So there's the focused learning process where you're sort of getting up to speed, and then you hit sort of a plateau. Eventually, you hit several plateaus, but your final plateau is the plateau on which you can generally support your like day-to-day life. You can communicate with people on most subjects. You can navigate your way through the world with relatively small amounts of inconvenience, and you're still like even then it's not done.
Hmm.
And I think we talked about our experience. So just to review the numbers, right? I had 2 years of high school Japanese. I had 3 years in college, and I had 4 years in Japan before I passed the N1 exam. So that is 7 years of continuous active study, and it took place over the course of 11 calendar years.
Right.
And it's just you can't like that in and of itself, I think, is something that it's really difficult to appreciate about learning a language. And yes, some people learn faster than others, right? Uh, People will, there literally are people who can teach themselves to an acceptable level of understanding and ability in a language in a matter of months. And that's amazing.
Mm.
But I don't think that's most people's experience. Certainly, it's not my experience. And so the way that I approach language learning is it's an endurance event. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this that you want to share.
No, I completely agree. I mean, you do get. I mean, I'm aware of people who are able, even not just in terms of speed, but also the fact they can do it self-study, which
Hmm.
just seems incredible. It's like everything. There's always going to be people who are wired differently and can
Hmm.
just pick it up like incredibly quickly, and they can, again, with the right motivation, they can just and discipline, they can accelerate the process. Um, but yeah, I agree. It is very much, yeah, marathon, not a sprint. I think sprint is the wrong way to go about it. You're not memorizing something for a test and just dumping it onto the page and then walking out of the exam hall. It's languages are this sort of living and breathing thing that you are going to utilize. It's a day-to-day thing. It's either for your job or because you're living in the country or whatever the main sort of thing is. Especially when you're learning it for that process. If you're just learning it just to give yourself like a challenge, that's maybe different. But yeah, it's going to be something that's just going to constantly be evolving, and you go through. You're talking about plateaus, but at least for me, I'm sure most people could probably identify with this, that you go through these stages where you feel extremely confident with the language, even though your level is still low. You feel like, oh, I'm making so much progress. I'm really going up that learning curve. And then you hit a brick wall with something, and even though you've learned so much up to that point, you can't get past that certain hurdle, and it feels like everything's bogging down and getting slow, and then it picks back up again, and it's not this nice smooth journey. It goes through twists and turns, like, but it's kind of sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's kind of how life is. It's not going to be this nice simple straight linear path, and it's but I think that what makes it fun. And if you as I said, aptitude is really important, but attitude is more so, because you can overcome certain deficiencies in terms of maybe ability by just being more like determined, and you'll push through those difficulties, and you'll apply yourself more. So no, I completely agree with all that.
Yeah. And I feel like that's one of the things about the language learning process that I think it's important to let people know, like when they're going in, is listen, you're going to have these periods where you feel like you're a genius, right? You feel like you've got it figured out. And then you're also going to have these periods where it feels like you're doing nothing. And I wanted to emphasize too, like in addition, like not just the fact that I had those 2 years in high school that I felt like I failed, but that what I thought I didn't learn anything, but what I actually did take away from it was still helpful, right? I think that along with that, you get these gaps where you feel like you're not making progress. Maybe you stopped doing any sort of formal training or study entirely. You put it down for like a year or two. If you put it back in, if you pick it back up again, the time that you put in will not betray you, right? Like, and you need to be ready for these moments that are going to feel like downers, and try and find ways to keep yourself going. And another point that I had down is that the importance of long-term reinforcement, which I think you spoke to. I actually have kind of a funny story about this. Friend of the podcast, Strider, decided at one point that he wanted to teach himself Japanese. And he got several different textbooks, and he got a set of flashcards, and to my astonishment, in the course of a single day, he taught himself both the hiragana and the katakana alphabets. And I didn't believe it. I was like, you can't have learned, like, I believe that you can pick up hiragana and katakana pretty quick. Like, I think most people can do that relatively fast. But a day is pushing it. Like, that's kind of absurd to me. I was like, you did not. You did not. I'm going to quiz you. And I quizzed him, and he nailed it. There are some katakana in particular that look very similar to one another. Like, you really have to have studied your stuff to be able to differentiate some of these katakana, like tsu versus shi. And he got every single question I gave him right. And I was like, I can't believe it. You did it. You learned hiragana and katakana in a day. You know how long it lasted him? About a week. Because he never used it again.
Right, there's no follow-up.
Yeah. It was exactly the same as the sort of situation that I was in college, where it was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to learn this kanji for this test. Am I going to retain it? No, because kanji go into a black hole in my mind. I feel like that's part of the thing to emphasize with the long-term nature of language learning, is that you also get long-term reinforcement that you need to do, and that you need to constantly be using. And like, I can remember classes where it was like, oh, I need to say this thing in Japanese. How can I do it? And someone else will say something. I'll be like, oh, right, that grammar exists.
Right. It's not just a particular subject or the whole language, but there's also aspects of that language, right? There'll be even like vocabulary that you'll pick up at some point, but then
Hmm.
not use it because you don't find yourself in that situation. And then even though that vocabulary might have got taught to you at say B1 level, you might suddenly be as a C1 student, and that vocabulary just doesn't come because it's gone into the black hole, and you don't remember it. If you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yep,
As a language as a whole,
definitely.
but also of very particular aspects of it. So it's about that constant going, and that's why I don't stress myself too much. If I don't forget a word, even though my teacher will be like,
Hmm.
"Oh, come on, I taught you this the other day," right? I'm terrible at that. Vocabulary just goes in one ear and goes out the other with me sometimes. If I use it, then it'll stick. It pick.
Hmm.
And I almost, if I set myself challenges in terms of like, I want to use that vocabulary, I'll make sure in the next writing I use it. Or if I try and fit it into a sentence, then it'll get stuck in my brain. Then I won't forget it again.
Hmm.
It'll be there loitering with intent for when I need it. But otherwise, it just evaporates into thin air. But I think that's again, it depends. Again, some people are really good at that, and they just see a word once and they've got it, and they know what it is. I think as a person, you need to try and maybe this is where learning as an adult is very advantageous because you've gone through the whole sort of
Yes.
education system and you know what type of learning works best for you, and you know your own
Yes.
strengths and weaknesses, and you can accept your weaknesses and you build upon your strengths. And I think that's very helpful,
Hmm.
rather than the whole sort of one size fits all sort of attitude of the education system at times.
Exactly. Yeah, that's literally you've segued exactly into my next point,
Yay! Look at this,
which
we're
is
in sync.
yeah, because language learning is such a long and involved process, I think it's personal. And what kills the language learning process, in my experience, is the slow drift away from practice, especially when it feels like you're not making progress. Those sort of like gaps that I talked about before. And this was explicitly my experience with Old English, where I think I talked about how I was on this high from having learned Japanese, and I also mentioned how I had this amazing experience drilling a lot of Japanese vocab. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to drill a bunch of Old English vocab and I'll be good, right? And I started drilling vocab and I wasn't using it. I wasn't trying to read any Old English text. I mean, I can't speak to anyone in Old English, but you can still find ways to apply it in ways that are relevant beyond just doing a bunch of flashcards. And I never did. I just kept going with the flashcards. And some of the only reason we have some of these words like on record is because they were used in the texts. And so some of the uses, like some of the meanings, are highly specific to the fact that, they came from this one particular text. And I wasn't getting any of that context. I was just going down the glossary, right? I was just creating my own little vocab flashcards, and it was hopeless. So I was like, even this aspect of language learning that I know worked for me in Japanese, like it was too early, right? Like I feel like, as you mentioned before, like when you have a skeleton to attach these things to, either from formal study or from use or this like sequence of events and things, like that's where you can slot in vocab. But if you just go straight for the memorization of the vocab, you're going to be in trouble.
Right.
Yeah, and I think again the question of how you get yourself to continue is tied to motivation, as we've mentioned several times before, and that motivation is personal. So that's where you sort of need to know how you learn languages, how not just language, how you learn in general. What are some things that you like, right? Because I think you should be rewarding yourself along the way. Like you need to celebrate your victories, and you need to find ways to like mitigate your poor performances and be like, I can pick myself back up from them, pick myself back up from this, because ultimately the failure case does not come from I failed a test, I did badly at this situation. The failure case comes from I stopped.
Mm. Yep. And
And go ahead.
focus it on it in terms of um, the like a general trend, not specific data points. If you want to get to like a statistical, right, perspective. Like if you're
Hmm.
having a crap day, I have it a lot of the time where sometimes Spanish just flows from my brain and my mouth very easily. Other times it
Hmm.
doesn't, and it's just I
Yeah.
cannot get a single word out without lacking confidence or mixing up genders and all this sort of stuff. But again, don't focus on it in terms of the roller coaster of going from a high to a low. Look at the general trend. As long as you're trending upwards, you're learning stuff, you're improving, you're progressing. what you want to focus on. Don't focus on the individual transitions between data points and between days. That's kind of the way I look at the big picture and not
Hmm.
the day to day stuff.
Yep, I completely agree. And to go along with the general trend of the argument here, I've never heard of one study method that actually works for everyone.
Hmm.
There are all sorts of things that will sell themselves as that method, and I've yet to encounter one of them that actually is one size fits all. Right? It doesn't exist. You
Right.
need to try and find a way to tailor your specific language learning experience. Because if you don't stick with it, then that's where you don't learn the language.
Right.
And this is where I have a little whole like sub section. It's a little bit of a tangent that sort of ties in with something we've talked about before, which is I feel like a lot of people talk about immersion as the one sort of go-to method that does work, that everybody benefits from immersion. And I believe in immersion, right? I don't want to go so far as to say that immersion is not helpful because I do believe immersion is helpful. However, I do not think it is a panacea.
Right. It's not
Uh,
like a silver bullet, right? That fixes all other language learning problems. Um, I guess it
yeah.
depends on
So,
where exactly you're going with it. But like the examples I give off at the sort of the beginning of the podcast, I know people who have spent months slash a year living in an English speaking country and they come back and they can't speak English because
yeah.
they've been hiding from my own experience of going to Germany. You wouldn't know
Hmm.
that I went to Germany for a year because I can't speak German.
Yep.
If you hide away from the opportunities, or you don't focus on it enough, or you don't get corrected, or whatever it is, I don't know what other ideas you've got in mind for that, but yeah, it's so easy. It doesn't work. Again, it's attitude. If you apply yourself, immersion accelerates the process by
Exactly.
I don't
Yeah.
know by tenfold, easy.
Hmm. Yeah.
But it's not this thing that guarantees it. And I think that's the problem. And I think there's a bit of a trend happening here at the moment
Hmm.
with especially slightly more well-off families thinking, oh, I'll just send my kid over to
Hmm.
the States or England or Ireland or wherever, and they'll be coming back and they can get the B2 easy. That's not how that works.
Right.
That's definitely not how it works. If the person, if it's a kid or an adult, doesn't matter if they have the right attitude and stuff, yes. But it's not as simple as that. It's,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yep. And so, just in general, first of all, I agree. Like, I think you still need to actively try to learn, particularly in the case. And I think one of the ways that I saw this at work the most was kanji, the writing system for Japanese. I don't care how much you are exposed to that. If you don't study kanji, you will never figure them out.
Hmm. I'll take
Like,
your word for it.
yeah. Like, uh, it's just you just have to learn them. That's the only way to do it. Right? You just have to memorize them.
Hmm.
Like you can go about memorizing them in different ways. I know a person who I mentioned I went to this interpreter training class,
Mhm.
and we went around the room. We talked about our learning Japanese experiences, and there was this woman who was like, "Yeah, I just read manga. Like I bought manga from Japan and read it. That's how I learned Japanese." And that is an astonishing statement to me because I'm going to bring up some other examples here because I think that's a really, really hard thing to do. And it'll sort of reinforce that point. But even someone like her who like figured out the hiragana and katakana, like that was like straight memorization. And then she used the fact that manga in particular always has what they call furigana in Japanese, which is they put the hiragana or the katakana or whatever over the kanji so that kids can read the words even though they can't necessarily understand the kanji. And so
Oh.
she was able to then learn the vocabulary word through her knowledge of hiragana katakana and then eventually associated that kanji with the meaning of the word. But even that
Goodness.
process is still a process of memorization. It's still a process of, it's not like, she got dropped in Japan and looked at lots of kanji and figured it all out. No, she had to actively apply herself
Mhm.
and do all that memorization. And I did all that memorization and I did it in a different way, but I still like you just have to learn them. And so I don't think you can just like go over and learn the Japanese writing system from immersion. There needs to be more that goes into it. And yes, it's super helpful, right? Like if you're studying in a flashcard, and this happened to me all the time when I was studying kanji. You study something on a flashcard, and then you walk around and you see it in the city. Like it's amazing. It feels like you found a magic word.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's this instant hit of reinforcement, and it feels good, and it makes you feel like it helps you feel like you're making progress. So it's absolutely fantastic to be in an environment where you can see kanji, quote unquote, in the wild.
Right.
But
Right.
that in and of itself, right? It's necessary. I don't even know if it's necessary, but it's definitely, it accelerates the process, like you were talking about, like it, maybe 10 times.
Yeah.
But in and of itself, it's not going to get you all the way. And sort of to reinforce what I was saying with the difficulty of learning by manga, I tried to do that because one of my chief motivations for learning Japanese was because I love Japanese media. And it was like, I want to experience this, in the raw, right? Like I want to like watch anime without needing subtitles. I want to be able to read manga without needing a translation. I want to play video games in Japanese. And that was one of my chief motivations. So as soon as I could, I tried to apply myself and read these things. Every single time I failed. And again, to bring up the same sort of interpretation course that I took in Japan, one of the instructors who was telling us about like studies that people have done in language learning in particular, mentioned that a lot of people will want to put themselves in a situation where they're like, I can just sit down, try and read this book, look up all the words I don't know, look up all the grammar I don't know, and by the time I get to the end of the book, I'll be able to read that language. And that's a terrible way to do it. Okay. And the way that this guy explained it was you ideally should know 90% of what's on a given page. Like if you want to study by picking up a book, you should know 90% of what's on the page. And you can look up words here and there. But if you have to look up every single word and you have to look up every single grammar point, you are going to burn out fast. And that was 100% corroborated by my experience.
I can't imagine doing that for a book. I tried to do that with a TV series. There's a point, maybe it was during the pandemic, I can't remember exactly what it was. But I said to myself, right, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to watch a series in Spanish, a series I know nothing about. And I watched the first episode, but I realized I just kept pausing it too often to look up words I didn't know. So eventually I just said, nope, this is not going to work. I'm going to burn out. I'm going to hate this. Let's just watch through the whole series. And I will pick very select words that I look up. If I see a word that gets used often that I can't work out what it was called, then I'm going to look it up. I can't imagine doing it for a book. I'd get to the end of the first page and I would have driven myself nuts, I think.
Yeah, that's basically what happened to me.
That just saps all the enjoyment out of it too, right?
It does, which is ironic because once you have that ability and you can watch the media in the native language, that's the most fun way to learn. But it's the least fun way to start.
Right. You need to reach a certain base level before you can take on that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it ties into another principle. This wasn't at the interpretation seminar. This was more of a general demonstration that I went to as part of the JET program. And it was more of like, so every year we had to do these like teacher improvement seminars. And a lot of them felt like busy work, but every now and then there would be a gem that you would get out of the process. And one of the gems for me was there was this woman who was putting on a presentation on language learning and talking about the idea of you have this principle of meet people if you want them to learn through like experience or whatever. You meet them where they are, and then you take that level and you plus one, right? Like you don't add a lot to it. You just introduce one new thing at a time, sort of, right? Like that can change the more they know, right? But basically, the idea is you start out with very little or almost nothing, and then you just slowly add a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And it was really cool to watch as a presentation because she taught us, oh shoot, I'm forgetting what country it was, but it was one of the Scandinavian languages. And she started with like using a gesture to indicate herself and saying her name. And so that gave us a baseline, which is, okay, I understand like what that gesture means. So now we have the plus one of her name. Now, okay, I've clocked that that's her name. And then she would say her name and she would do a verb, right? So she would start, let's say she started dancing, right? And then she said her name and then in the language, the word for dancing.
Hmm.
And you could figure out, oh, I know the gesture, I know her name, I know what she's doing. I see she's dancing. Like this is the whatever the language is, this is the word for dancing. And she built it up to the point where by the end of the presentation, we could understand like a whole sentence. And it was really cool because it was like a demonstration of the point in and of itself in the presentation that she was saying like, okay, you get this base level and then you just slowly layer a little bit more and eventually you get to this like really high level experience.
Hmm.
But I use that as an example to sort of reinforce it's the plus one. It's not plus 100, right? Like people don't do well when they have to learn in a highly opaque situation, just like with the kanji writing or like trying to like pick up a random novel and start reading it, and that's how you're going to teach yourself.
No, I completely agree. Um, and it's something that I've now I'm getting to that point where I could maybe start consuming media
Mm.
in Spanish. I have thought, do I take on a novel? Do I take on a TV series again? But you do always fear it's going to be too much. But I think now because
Mm-hmm.
of now I've gone through the process, I can probably be a little bit kinder to myself in terms of not stressing so much and trying to apply 100. I'll pick that very specific one or two
Mm-hmm.
and just slowly build it up over time. And I was going to say now it's still a joy to me, right? Because as I said, my wife and I always talk in English. She watches films and TV shows like the Jane Austen series and that in uh, in English.
Mm-hmm.
But she's still learning. She's still on that journey. All
Mm-hmm.
these years later, and what was it? Oh yeah, the word balderdash came up in Sanditon,
Ah.
and she just looked at me, and I was like, yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
a word. So that's the thing. It's just you're always on that journey, so you don't like stress and panic about understanding everything. Just try and understand the gist of what's going on, and then you return to it in a year. Oh, right, I understand more. Right, I can look at more specific stuff and so on. It just yeah, it's if you try to understand every single damn thing that's on the page or whatever, you're gonna lose. I guess it depends on the person, but I personally would lose my mind over it because I've done
Oh
it
yeah.
once with just one episode of a TV show, not even thinking about a book,
Mm-hmm.
and it just sapped the enjoyment out of it. And languages are meant to be fun at the end of the day. They're really at the end of the day, yes, you use them for work or study, but they're also just you can talk to other people. That's just
Mm-hmm.
such a fun thing to be able to do, and to watch or like if you're not talking to people, you can watch media from another country and you can understand it, and that's just great. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it should be something that's yeah, it's difficult at times and it has these up and downs, but it should be enjoyable. So don't make it in a way. Don't make it in a way that's not enjoyable. Make it difficult, but don't make it unenjoyable.
Yeah.
That's the thin line that you gotta make sure you don't cross over. Um,
Yeah. Definitely.
the thing
And oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say it depends on where you want to transition, but the thing for me that was the most difficult, and it's kind of interesting you talking about the in the wild thing that kind of then
Mm-hmm.
revolves for me. I mean, there's quite a few things with Spanish. The big issue, and you would have been the same. Actually, I actually don't know about this about Japanese. How easy is Japanese grammar, especially like verb conjugation and this sort of stuff? Is it quite basic or?
Well, there's sort of different levels. So the what I would say is the standard level, like because the way the Japanese works is different politeness levels, basically.
Mm,
So the standard formality level is relatively straightforward. So you want to talk about irregular verbs. Japanese has two irregular verbs.
oh, nice.
That's that's it. Yep. It's suru and kuru. And they tend to conjugate like they conjugate differently than all the other verbs, but they are within themselves generally internally consistent. And there is no past tense. No, listen to me. There's no future tense. It's just past and non-past. Um, so like there are certain like elements of Japanese grammar that I found way easier than say Spanish grammar, where you've got to account for like, okay, am I talking about first, second, or third person?
Hmm.
Like am I going to do with the verb? Do I have to worry about number? Like Japanese has counters, which is complicated and annoying, but the the number system itself is really straightforward. Where Japanese gets more complex is when you start layering on formality, and all of a sudden, remember how I said there are two irregular verbs? Well, there's a lot more now. And some verbs, turns out they get completely replaced by other verbs. And uh, you need to know when to use humble language versus when to use polite language and
Right.
how to interface back and forth. And the more social a situation gets, the more factors you have to be juggling in your head at all times, right? So you get to a very high level of complexity. Personally, I can say that grammar isn't one of the areas in Japanese language learning that I really struggled with. I always had a fairly easy time picking up the grammar, but I know people who that was their Achilles heel. So,
Mm.
yeah, take that for what it's worth.
Okay. I feel. I
And
mean.
I
Oh,
should also qualify. I say that having never needed to learn the like highest level of formality. That still eludes me. That's another language barrier that I could in theory push myself to overcome, but I have not done so yet. So, sorry.
that's okay. I guess you've not had the necessity to. So
Yeah.
yeah. I guess it wouldn't matter. I mean, I'm not. This is not me picking on Spanish specifically. This would be almost any language, especially at least in the European realm, because they're the language that I'm more familiar with. English verb conjugation is just so basic.
Hmm.
All verb. There are a lot of irregular verbs going into the past, but it's the same if it's I or you or he or she or we and they. Um, Present
Hmm.
tense is very easy apart from the verb be, and if it's he, she, it. You know what I mean? Grammatically speaking, it's a very basic language. There are some weird quirks, but the main issues with English, I feel, would be more like pronunciation. And
Hmm.
also the mix of vocabulary because it's got Germanic roots and Latin roots and then French roots, and it's a bit of a mess in that sense. But grammar is quite nice. So obviously then any European language, and obviously Spanish is part of that. The big issue is then you learn the infinitive verb, the verb you see in the
Hmm.
dictionary, but then you have to think, oh, if it's I, it's different. If it's you, it's different. And then that you got to go through all that process. That's the present tense. Then you got the past tense, and then there's two past tenses in Spanish, just to make it even more difficult. And I still don't know which one is correct in certain situations. I keep mixing them up. Um, and then you've got then the future conjugates differently. The big thing for me, once I've got over that hurdle, the one that really does my head in still is a thing called
Hmm.
the subjunctive. I don't know if that
Uh,
ah
it rings bells from old high school classes. Yeah.
right, okay.
I don't think I ever got my head around the subjunctive.
All right, well, I can try and explain it a little bit here. The subjunctive is basically an additional sort of verb tenses. I want to say because there is technically a past form of it, but it's not really past form. But whatever, it's wacky. I think it does exist in English, but the problem is because our verb conjugation is so basic, you don't notice it. I think the time you do notice it is, for example, if you use second conditional and you say, for example, if I were you,
Hmm.
that I think that's subjunctive because it should be if I was you, but it changes.
Hmm.
Um, um, and also, I think if you say something like "it is important that he go to the doctor," not "he goes to the doctor," I think that's a
Hmm.
form of the subjunctive age because the verb conjugation is so basic you don't notice it. In Spanish, the subjunctive is everywhere, and it is the bane of my existence. I am in a constant battle with the subjunctive. The
Hmm.
subjunctive's use is basically for you can use it for desire or want. So the first experience I had of the subjunctive was not actually by studying the grammar; it was just by hearing people talk.
Hmm.
So if you say, for example, the opposite of the subjunctive is the indicativo. Indicative,
Hmm.
I guess, in
Yeah.
English. I
Yeah.
don't even.
Indicative.
Indicative?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
If you just want to say, you sleep well, would be duermes bien. That's
Hmm.
fine. But if you want to say to somebody, um, I hope you sleep well, if
Hmm.
they're going off to bed, you'd say, espero que, I hope that, espero que duermas bien. This the the more, is it morphem in English? The part more, I know it in Spanish, morphema, like the,
Morpheme.
oh, morpheme. There you go. Okay, right. You can tell I learned it in Spanish and not in English, right? The morphema, the
Yeah.
little suffix at the end of the word indicating the relationship, like to what person it is and whatever. It changes from es
Mm-hmm.
to as, and that's
To
a
AS. Yeah.
That's a subjunctive. It's the same when you leave a shop. You say que vaya bien, which means I hope. Basically, I hope everything goes well for you. But in indicative, it would just be va bien. It goes well.
Ah.
So that's one form of it. If you want to say in Spanish, I want a person to do something, and the person is somebody different, not yourself, you can't use
Mm-hmm.
infinitive. You'd have to say, quiero que hagas esto, or something like that, right? I want that you do this, but hagas is like the subjunctive form of hacer, which is the verb to do. So it
Mm-hmm.
comes in there. The other times it comes in is like in conditionals. So if you want to say, if I were you, you know,
Mm-hmm.
si fuera, and whatever, right? That comes in. If you start
Mm-hmm.
thinking of hypothetical situations, so if I just want to say a really basic sentence like, when I arrive home, I will do this. But
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not talking about routine, I'm talking about one-off occasion, I'd have to use the subjunctive cuando llegué a casa, not cuando llego a casa, and all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So when you think of imaginary situations, it's the same if I walk into a shop and say, I'm looking for a blue jacket. If I know the jacket exists, then I use the indicative. If I don't
Mm-hmm.
know that the jacket exists, then I would use saya, like the
Okay.
subjunctive form. Because I don't know that it
Yeah.
exists, I'm all hypothesizing.
It's a yeah. It's a hypothetical. Yeah.
Right, and that's the problem. And it's a real headache trying to work out when you should use subjunctive and when you shouldn't. And it's a trap I've fallen into so many times. My teacher would just look at me and go, "You forgot about the subjunctive, haven't you?" But
Mm-hmm.
now it's getting better. And the thing that really helped me with it, not that it's perfect by any means, but the one thing that really helped me with it was studying for the driving test in Spanish, especially the theoretical part, because there is
Mm-hmm.
so much of the theory book that's written in subjunctive, because it's thinking of imaginary situations. If there's a car that's
Ah.
waiting here, then all of that would be, in subjunctive, because it doesn't. It might happen, it might not, kind of thing, and then the rest of
Mm-hmm.
the sentence will be go back into indicative again. So that really helped me. I was able to see it in the wild. And go,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's why it's such. Okay, right, and then it started to click. It's not finished clicking
Right.
yet. It's still something I'm gonna have to keep fighting with. But that's sort of the big hurdle because I'd never come
Mm-hmm.
across it before. Maybe it's in French and German, but because I never reached a high enough level, I wouldn't have come across it. Um, so yeah, my big issue now is because obviously I'm living in Catalonia and it's a bilingual society. Because I haven't studied Catalan formally for quite a while, and the Catalan I did learn was very very basic. We didn't get round to that. I'm now confusing just by hearing people. I'm confusing indicative Catalan and subjunctive Catalan.
Uh.
If it's a phrase that I know well, like the Catalan version of Que vaya bien, I hope everything goes well for you, would be Que vagi bé. That I know,
Ah.
right, because of the situation, that is clearly subjunctive. That's fine.
Mhm.
But if it's a phrase that I don't know, I'm just hearing it in random context, I get confused quite a lot of the time. And I'll say to my wife, I thought, what's that verb? And then she'll say the infinitive word. Oh, but I thought it conjugates this way. No, but it's subjunctive. Oh, you got to be kidding me. So it's just I'm now going to fight with it in Catalan, which is going to be so much fun.
Ugh.
That's a process for another day. But that's kind of the main stumbling block is trying to get my head around that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously then all the different accents and the speed at which people talk. But I guess I'll have to go to the south of Spain and see how I get on. But fortunately, at least where I'm living in that, I've had okay experiences with people, and people have been normally really nice with me, and we've been able to have decent conversations more or less. It's something I talked about in a previous podcast. Again, it's slightly different, but the bilingualism throws up its
Mm-hmm.
own challenges
Yeah.
um, because there are people who you talk to and they can't change the chip. between the two languages. So even though you
Mm-hmm.
speak to them in Spanish, they start responding in Catalan, and you think, can you say that again, but in Spanish, please? um,
Yeah.
and
I will say, like, it is tough to make that switch. Like, I've been in situations, or like I've even seen depictions in media where people will switch back and forth between English and Japanese, and it's like you need to know what you're listening for in order to really make sense of it. So,
right.
like if you're expecting one language and you get the other, like something that you could have understood easy, like will just go right over your head, and then it'll click and be like, oh, you said that in the other language. Hold on a minute.
hmm I think the thing is though, I need to actually research this a bit more. I think bilingualism is not represented correctly in media.
Yeah.
Is my
Oh,
gut
I completely
feeling.
agree.
And
Yeah.
monolingual people don't really understand how bilingualism works.
Mm-hmm.
It's something it's been quite interesting when I've gone back to the UK and I've spoken to family members or friends or whatever, and when I kind of explain to them how Catalan and Spanish coexist, it's not how they think it would coexist. It seems like people would be able to switch at will
Right.
within the
Mm-hmm.
same sentence. It's like, no, that's not how it works. I mean, sometimes people will forget a word in one language, so they'll
Yeah.
substitute the same word from the different language in and carry on the rest of the sentence in the original language, and that's fine. But it's
Mm-hmm.
not like, oh, I'll say a sentence in Spanish and then I'll switch to Catalan and then back to Spanish. No, that's not how it works. You fix a
Right.
relationship with a certain person in that language and then you stay in that
Yep.
language. You never switch over.
Yeah. I brought that up before. Actually, this reminds me of something that we submitted on your community Discord, Scott Stored. We opened up the thing for questions,
Mhm.
and one of the questions had to do with honorifics in Japanese.
Right.
And like, what do I do in a sort of bilingual situation where I'm writing English language emails, but all these Japanese business people are adding san, which is a Japanese honorific,
Mm.
usually gets translated as like, Mr. So and so in those sorts of situations. But really, it's just a level of respect that you like attach to a certain person's name that symbolizes a particular relationship, right? I think that's the sort of abstract but general way to understand it. San is just sort of like uh, neutral formal, and then there are some where, so for instance, another one that you'll run into fairly commonly is chan, which is like informal and personal. Uh, and there are you can get more formal and potentially more impersonal with sama. So those three are fairly well known even among people who are just like watching Japanese media. There was this whole movement in manga translation to leave honorifics even in the English language, like leave in the Japanese honorifics, which is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, but we can maybe get into that another day. Um, but like that whole indication of like respect or relationship, like once you like when you speak Japanese with someone, once you interact with them and you get used to calling them with a particular honorific, that locks in.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, like this person is always so and so san, or this person is always so and so chan, right? This person is always so and so kun, right? This person is always what, and you can go through life events that will change the theoretical relationship between the two of you, and there's this friction where sometimes you change the honorific and it's like, oh, like it's a real marker that your relationship with that person has changed,
Oh.
and sometimes you don't change the honorific and it's like, okay, like now and it can be a really significant thing to be like, to like, I remember like this is like just a Japanese language class that I went to, or no, not language, culture class, while I was studying in Japan, and the person was talking about how at the bank they always use honorific language with you when you are dealing with the money that you have in the bank. But as soon as you go in for a loan, they start speaking informally because now you're asking them for money and they have all the power. And
Uh,
she was explaining how like it just adds this feeling of like a slap in the face. Like for this particular person, it's like, oh, now you need money from us. Well, now now
Yeah.
you don't deserve our respect. So, but that aspect of like, first of all, you don't switch back and forth in between in a single sentence. Yeah, true. Also, you tend to lock into certain ways of like speaking with particular people,
Right.
right? And so and so san is just always so and so san in your mind.
Right. And because the same aspect works when you've got bilingualism. Even if the two people who are talking know two languages, their relationship will become fixed in that one. And I've asked
Hmm.
people in various, I mean, especially when people are quite incredulous and go, "You speak English all the time with your wife?" and all this sort of thing, right? But she's from Spain. She's Catalan and Spanish. You're now living here, right? What are you doing? And I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, well let's do a thought experiment. How do you speak with your mother? How do you speak with your father? How do you speak with your siblings? And they'll say Catalan or Spanish. And I'm like, right, okay. Imagine you speak to them in the other language. How would it feel? And they all say the same answer. Oh, it'd be weird. It'd be strange.
Hmm.
I was like, that is exactly the same situation with my wife and I. We
Hmm.
met in English. Our relationship, and not just relationship in terms of romantic aspects of the relationship, but just the friendship aspect of the relationship and the way we understand how each other think. And it's more intimate because we're talking about a soulmate and not just a friend. But it doesn't matter. Everything you
Hmm.
know about that person is associated with that language that you got to know them in. And if we
Right.
try to speak in the other language, there's something weird going on. It's not completely natural.
Hmm.
I guess it depends. I have heard of people who have like a multilingual relationship and they mix the languages. I don't fully believe that's the case, but okay, I'm willing to be proven wrong. Um, there has to be, even if you've got a multilingual relationship, there has to be one language that is like the anchor.
Hmm.
I'd imagine, but maybe I'm wrong with that. But feel free people to comment if I'm wrong. If you've got an example of if you live in a multilingual friendship or relationship or something, then by all means, correct me. But I don't believe that is truly the case. Um, there'll be one that will be the more stable
Hmm.
language at least. It just depends on what circumstances you meet under. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of the tie-in that I saw with the Japanese honorifics because it's like you meet these people in one set of relationships, and it can be, like I said, a marker of how your address to that person does or doesn't change based on the changing circumstances.
hmm. Well,
Um,
the exception to that would be was in I think we brought it up a couple of podcasts ago, but when Chris was having in abroad in Japan, Chris was having a conversation with somebody, and the way they were interacting with each other was with a certain amount of formality of that they were of the same age.
mhm,
And this must be very early on in the friendship, right? It wasn't as if they went a long time and then they switched. But once the other guy he was speaking to realized that
mhm.
he was older than Chris, then suddenly the formality switched completely.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that like that's believable and believable, like it might not have happened. No, I believe Chris Broad. It's believable in the sense that, like you pointed out, I think it's early enough in establishing that relationship dynamic that they haven't solidified anything yet, so they're still sort of figuring out what the proper addresses should be,
Right,
right?
right.
So,
Yeah, if it's the first time you're meeting somebody, you're still trying to, feeling them out and trying to work out
hmm.
what is going on here and how you relate to them and stuff. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a big sort of bugbear with me is that when I meet new people, I'm trying to make sure that the conversation starts off in Spanish. Because if it starts off
Hmm.
in English, that's it.
Yeah.
It's never, and the problem is then people look at me and go, oh, right, he's British. And then maybe there's a little bit of a negative stereotype that I'm fighting against that people think, oh, he's British, he's not going to know Spanish. Especially if they don't know how long I've been living here. If it's different, depending on what sort of social situation I meet them under.
Hmm.
If it's known very early on, all right, he's been living here for 5 years. He's going to know the language. That's grand. Like tomorrow, I'm actually going to go with my wife and to another couples. We're going to play board games for most of the day. Um, and even though I think the two of them know English and they're very well travelled and they're quite cultured, we just all speak Spanish to each other. Although they might speak
Hmm.
Catalan to my wife, but then as a whole team, we'll speak in Spanish because that's how the relationship formed, and they know that was the
Hmm.
situation. We met under, and it's fixed that way. And I'm really happy. It's like, yeah, we could and go and speak Spanish for the whole afternoon. So it's
Yep.
it's it's good. Um,
Yeah, and to bring this back to sort of my like general set of arguments here, like I do think that on the subject of immersion, you can sort of create islands of immersive that are more or less immersive, right? So you can have this group where you've established, okay, we're going to go play board games. We're going to all speak in Spanish because that's what this group speaks, right? And that gives you an opportunity to listen and to practice your speaking skills.
mhm.
And that's great. That's a pocket of immersion, right? And then you have this other pocket where it's like, okay, you're with your wife, you're speaking English, you're not really doing a whole lot with learning your English skills, but your wife is practicing, and right. So,
Mhm.
um, so it's a different sort of immersive environment in that sense. And I know that when I was in the JET program, like we were in a bubble where we didn't necessarily have to learn or do much interaction with Japanese.
Right.
Um, because like we were paired up with teachers who were teaching English, so they had some level of English knowledge. And we had a supervisor who was like supposed to like guide everybody through their like living situation and process and things. There was a lot of support in that regard, at least when we first came in. Um, and it was a situation where like okay beyond a certain transactional level like I need enough to go to the convenience store or the grocery store like that sort of thing uh you can sort of get by with very little Japanese. So even though you're in Japan, you've got this pocket of English speaking people that you're surrounded by, and that isn't immersive even though you're living in Japan, like
Yeah.
sort of the people they go to Ireland. Or when I was in my college and we had the sort of opposite where it's like okay I'm in the States but I'm in this intensive Japanese language class. We're going to the Japanese language table. You're like, it's not, yeah, literally not all day that I'm immersing myself in Japanese, but it's a pocket of Japanese immersion, even though I'm in a totally different environment.
Right. And the same thing. I was going to say happened, but it's not so much, especially since Brexit, not so much. But a lot of English people would come over to Spain to have like a gap year or to, as my wife says, live la
Mm-hmm.
vida loca for a couple of years and just, live in the sun and whatever and teach them English. But again, they're surrounded by Spanish and or Catalan in this case if they're living in Catalonia every day, but if the only people they really socialize with are other English people, which makes sense because you see like seeks like in the sense, especially when you're in a new place, try to find a little bit of continuity. Oh, there's another English person there, right? Or in your
Mm-hmm.
case, where they actually help, they're guiding you through the bureaucracy and the accommodation, all that sort of stuff. And that's completely normal. But as you said, you're not going to get the immersion, and it kind of makes sense how a lot of people can live in a place for 1 or 2 years, but they don't really pick up very much. Especially if there's somebody in the
Mm-hmm.
group who can speak more than the others, and they can do all the heavy lifting. Um,
Yeah.
I even had it with, I maybe I've said this before on a podcast or stream, I can't remember, but now it's a little bit different because I think now I've kind of not. I want to make this clear. It's not like I've told my wife off or anything, but I think also she's realised that my Spanish is getting pretty good, and she's gonna
Mm-hmm.
just. Not that she didn't encourage me before, by the way. She's very supportive of me, but it'd always be the case of when we would go out, it'd just be too easy for me to let her do all the
Mm-hmm.
heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And if we go into, even if it's just ordering something at a restaurant, it's just too easy for her to say the order. And this sounds really bad to say, and I don't mean this like negatively against her, but there are sometimes where I actually liked it going out, not to a restaurant necessarily, but just going out, and if she wasn't with me, because in
Ah.
terms of the language learning experience, obviously I'd be really upset I didn't have her company, but from the language learner perspective, I was forcing myself. I had to do all the heavy lifting,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when you're maximizing that, even if it's just for a short trip to the supermarket or whatever. You're forcing yourself into situations where you have to take the lead and you're going
Right.
to have to do it for yourself. And now, like before Christmas, we had to go and buy a car and stuff. And then I was going on my own when my
Mm-hmm.
wife was working on certain days. I was going to the car dealership on my own to talk to the guy about certain details or to check out the car or whatever. And I was having to do it all myself. But
Mm-hmm.
I was looking forward to it, going and having to do
Mm-hmm.
it on my own. And sometimes that puts you in uncomfortable situations, but you just have to get through it. So yeah, it's kind of sort of reiterating what we've kind of said before, right? It's
Yeah.
as I drop
I do
stuff all
think
around me.
I do think there's a practical angle that you can sort of take away from that, though, and it reminds me of something that I did while I was living in Japan, which is even though the script that you run through at a store is fairly standardized, that can be a strength, right? Especially if you're fairly new in the language learning process, or, well,
Mm.
I mean, buying a car isn't exactly a new thing, but if you're talking about relatively low level, like I just need some groceries,
Yes.
that's fairly
Yeah.
that's fairly run of the mill and common. But it gives you a script, and figuring out that script could be a good way to practice something. And so, like, I knew at one point that I was like, okay, I really struggle on the phone in Japanese because I don't have a lot of extra contextual information to guide me to an understanding of what's happening.
Hmm.
And so I would call in orders for pizza and try and find ways that I could engage in things that would make me make phone calls. Like I would pick up for like people who were trying to sell me something. And whereas normally I'd just put down the phone, I'd like try and navigate the conversation a little bit before I got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm not actually going to buy anything from you. Thank you. Um, just to go through the exercise of navigating that conversation. And one of the like sort of benefits that I think you can get from that approach, particularly when I was doing things like calling in an order for food, is you get an outcome right at the end of it. And it's you get to enjoy that, right? It's
Yeah.
so, you go to a car dealership, you come away with a car at the end of that process. It's its own little mini reward.
Hmm. Yeah. I also you not just the physical reward of the thing that you've bought or whatever, but it's also the conversation or the situation ends, and right, the objective of the conversation was reached. I ordered the pizza, or
Yeah,
I
exactly.
walked out the supermarket and didn't completely embarrass myself today, or whatever. I would do the same, especially if I maybe not so much now. It'd be interesting if I have to do this now with the car. I didn't do it so much, but in the earlier days, if I knew I had to go somewhere on my own and my wife wasn't going to be there providing me backup in terms of if something I misunderstood something, I would very quickly
Hmm.
before going out, I would research key vocabulary that I might need and have it
Hmm.
sort of already there in my brain or maybe written down as a backup plan in case something went wrong or and trying to think
Yep.
about what situations could come up, and that just that gives you a little bit of a lift. I mean, the problem is life doesn't work that way. Life's unpredictable. But especially in the
Yeah.
early days, where you try to make your interactions with the language a little bit more, as you said, standardized, a little bit more structured, and you got a
Hmm.
bit of anticipation of what you're going to be doing and where you're going to go and blah blah blah. If there's something that could potentially be difficult, researching it in advance might not be a bad thing. As you get
Yep.
move up the scale, then maybe you don't have to do that so much. You can go with the flow, and then you can see how well you adapt to certain situations.
Hmm. Yeah, but it can be very helpful, very rewarding. I like the tangible end state, right? Like it's really useful, especially at the beginning, I think.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yep. And then I think that this gets into other things that you can do, right? In terms of my little list here. Um, find systems that work for you, because this is ultimately this marathon process where you need to know how, like, so an example of how you as like a language learner can approach things, uh, like because there are so many of these, like, this is the method that really works. Well, maybe one of those will for you, right? You can try them out. And I have a great example of this where a lot of my friends, in order to learn kanji, they were also struggling with kanji. And one of the ways that you can approach, sort of the way I was mentioning how there's this system to the way that they're constructed, is there's this guy whose last name is Hasig, who's written a bunch of books on. He's created his own system basically for how to learn the kanji, and you take these little constituent parts of the kanji and you make up stories, right? You associate each little constituent part with a keyword, and then you string those keywords together to make a story, so that you have this sort of story-based understanding of how this kanji is put together, and like how that you can remind yourself to write it by referring to these individual parts and their stories. And
Is it kind of like this? Not the same method, but is it similar to how people try to memorize people's names? They try to
yes,
associate like certain physical characteristics, and they might try to make it rhyme or like almost like a story esque thing.
yeah, it's sort of like that. It's not exactly the same, but it's sort of like that. Now,
Okay.
to be fair, like I haven't actually done this method myself because what happened was I tried it and was like I like stories. I like coming up with stories, but this is going to take forever. And it's going to be because there's so many kanji. And you get to the end of the first phase of the process, and you haven't officially learned any of the readings for any of these kanji. So even though you can recognize them, you can write them, you don't necessarily know all of the meanings associated with them. You only know a few. And you don't know how they're pronounced. Now, granted, kanji like have more than one pronunciation that are associated with them, and like there are further books that you can do in this same person's method for learning kanji that will layer in those things that the first book doesn't emphasize. But to me, it seemed like a lot of effort to go through for a long time with a fairly minimal result. And I was like, I'm just gonna do as many flashcards as I can. And I mentioned before that flashcard process was like a gigantic leap forward going from like intermediate to advanced level Japanese. I don't think it would necessarily, because again, my experience with English, it might not have helped me that much at the beginning. But at the stage where I was in Japanese, when I started studying those flashcards, it was like magic. It was, and it wasn't like so. Another example. There are these things out there. I don't know if you've heard of the spaced repetition systems.
No.
Okay, so think of this as like an intelligent flashcard system. There's a program that I use called Anki that does this for you. But the way that it basically works is you look at a flashcard and you determine, okay, first of all, did I get it right or wrong? And if you got the flashcard wrong, you put it in a pile to be tried again, like in the near future, right? Like 5 minutes. And if you get it right, you have three different options. You can say, show me this again, and it's got different lengths of time that it's automatically calculated in based on some algorithm that the people who designed the program came up with. But for instance, you might say, show me this again in a day, show me this again in 2 days, show me this again in 3 days, depending on how confident you are. Like if you just looked at the flashcard and instantly got it, you could be okay, 3 days. If you looked at the flashcard and were like, I got it, but it wasn't like, it didn't feel firmly locked in, but it wasn't that much of a challenge, you can do it in 2 days. And then if you looked at it and you had to sort of struggle, but eventually you got it, you can do it in 1 day. And then so it creates this system where the flashcards that you're having a hard time with are the ones that you're seeing the most. And the flashcards that you're not really struggling with, you see less and less frequently. And there's no end to this process. I have quote unquote cards in my digital Anki deck that like they'll come up, and the options aren't like 1, 2, or 3 days. They're more like 5, 10, or 15 years because I've been studying them for so long. And so it's a never ending thing, which is sort of ties back to the sort of long distance language thing. And ultimately, I did switch, like I said, to this Anki system of spaced repetition, but particularly for the kanji flashcards, it was really helpful for me to just go through every single card that I had studied before and then get to the part that was new.
Hmm.
And so I would start from the beginning and go to the end every single time. And it was only that level of repetition that helped me like squeeze the kanji into my skull. When I was getting that constant reinforcement. And I started to notice those same sorts of patterns that Hasig really like pulls out for you. Um, and that was what worked for me. And my friends who were studying Hasig were like, yeah, okay, you're going to get a bit of a head start with flashcards, but eventually, because you're not really internalizing these stories and meanings and things, like over the course of a long period of time, like we're going to have a richer understanding and pull ahead. And well, they started Hasig after I started flashcards, so we couldn't do a direct comparison. It may well have worked out that way. But what I needed was a set of kanji flashcards and eventually a spaced repetition system. And what they needed was Hasig, and then of course they eventually all because these friends of mine were how I heard about the spaced repetition systems, and so they all moved to those to like learn the language as efficiently as possible. But these are all sort of different approaches. Well, two main differing approaches for how you navigate learning kanji. And they wanted one, I wanted the other. That's totally fine. We both got to we both got to the same goal in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So, yep, that's sort of just to reinforce that. And also, if anyone out there hasn't heard of spaced repetition systems, like they're really helpful, but in my experience, there was a phase in my learning process where the constant drilling was actually more helpful because you go through this thing where the stuff at the beginning is easier to remember, the stuff at the end is easier to remember, all this stuff in the long middle is really tricky. And it helps build confidence at the start, which I needed because I was so bad at kanji. And then the longer I did it, the more I would feel confident in the middle. And then I remember I had this gigantic box of flashcards and it was like two halves. And I got all the way to the end of the first half. And man, I felt invincible by the time I could do the entire first half of that box and not make a mistake. It was just like, magic.
I'll have to see if maybe there's something similar to that, but just for like vocabulary.
I'm sure there
For
is.
me,
Like, I'm
'cause
sure, like,
that would kind of
quite
help.
frankly,
Mm,
yeah, quite frankly, that Anki program, like, you can make your own flashcards in it, and you can, like, import other things that people have already made. So you could probably just use that for Spanish if you wanted to, you know, find a way to more efficiently drill vocab.
that's,
And it's supportive of different like media, right? So I know friends who will like they'll put in video clips and be like, "Did I understand this scene?" Right? And they'll use it that way. It's a very flexible, powerful, helpful tool if you haven't heard of it.
I'll have to. That'll be my homework over the weekend. See if there is something available.
Hey, there you go.
Okay. Can't think of anything else at the top of my
So
head that I want to talk about. I think.
okay,
I think for me, most things have been covered. Um,
yeah. So I do have one sort of concluding section here, which I've been slowly sort of building towards.
mhm,
Uh, and so remember, we started out with learning a language is an endurance event.
mhm,
It takes time, marathon, not a sprint. And then we moved on to because of that, I think you need to have a very personal approach. Know what works for you. Find systems. Immersion's helpful. It's not everything. You don't like you can create your own pockets of immersion. It's easier said than done, but it's not completely impossible. Um, but there's no one method that works for everybody. And as a result, I think that my advice, my general like high level advice, if you want to learn a language, is set up a series of long, short, and midterm goals that are tailored to your personal interest and your needs and your preferences. And I think that needs, for instance, like huge, absolutely huge, right? I need to meet this certification. Boom, there's a goal, right? It's like, okay, if I don't meet this, I can't go to school. If I don't meet this, I can't get into the study abroad program, right? Like they're like ready-made goals
right.
for you to go into the language learning process. And they'll be based off of your own motivation, right? Because you're the one who wants to go into the program.
Yeah.
And yep. And short-term goals are where I'd put things like vocabulary or flashcards or things like that, right? Where it's just I need to get through this many cards in a day, right? Like I need to do this many things at a time. And I feel like those can help combat that feeling of a plateau where it's like I'm not really doing anything. But they won't eliminate it, right? You still need to be prepared to deal with those down moments, even if you're meeting your quota that you set for yourself for the day, right?
Right.
Um,
And even if you're not learning anything new, reinforcement is still positive.
yes.
And even like, if yeah, it could be like learning new stuff, or even just actually applying it, going out and having a conversation, or having to go and do a specific task. We're going to utilize the language. That too is good as a short-term goal. Um,
Yeah. absolutely. And the short-term practice is what builds the long-term competence,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
it's where the rubber meets the road. So it's incredibly important. And the but in contrast to that, like you can sort of feel like you're on a treadmill to nowhere,
Mm,
which that's where the midterm goals come in. The midterm goals, I think, are where you feel your progress, where you're studying, and all of a sudden you realize, hey, I can read a book. I very strongly remember that moment. It's like, oh, now I can read novels in Japanese. I love to read novels. I'm going to read some Japanese novels. And that takes your learning. It's like this whole new world opens up
yeah.
because all of a sudden you're no longer limited to these like study materials and these flashcard sessions and these like
And
things
textbooks
that
and
quite, yeah, quite frankly are boring and dry.
yeah. Right. You're seeing it in the
And
wild, or you can watch something fun, something new, or something that you've already
mhm,
watched, but you can now watch it in the original language, or you want to watch it dubbed, and yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, or even
You're studying, but you're not studying. You're learning, but you're not studying. I think that's kind of the
yes,
that's always neat.
yeah. And there are different ways that you can sort of get there. So like I don't know if they have this for Spanish, but they have it for Japanese and they have it for English, at least in Japan, which they're called like graded readers, where they go in and they've selected like original language written texts and they've gone and they've like pre-sorted them into different levels of language learning. And
Hmm.
so they'll be like, "Oh, you're at the level where like Alice in Wonderland is like category 2 or like I don't actually know what it is."
Right.
Um,
As an example.
but it's
Sure.
like,
Sure.
yeah, like let's just say that Alice in Wonderland's a category 2 book. You know that after you've hit a certain like level of fluency in that language, you can then go and be like, okay, now I can pick up this level of the graded reader and just read it. And it's great to be able to sort of rely on that and get that extra like because you don't it can be a little bit of a trap to be like okay you have to do this for 5 years before you can then pick up a book. No, you can find something that people think was originally written in the language. People have determined okay this is going to go like this is going to be relatively achievable for someone at your level, and then you can slowly raise that level over time.
Hmm. I don't know if they do that for Spanish, but I mean, the one thing I know they do is in maybe not so good for adult learners, but in high school, they have like abridged versions
Hmm.
of novels, and then obviously because it depending on what year group it is, then the complexity has to increase going up
Hmm.
the year level. So there has to be something like that. If you're looking in the right place, you'll be able to find them. That's
Yep.
definitely true. Yeah.
In Japanese, it's not exactly the same thing, but I remember there are these books called like learn to read Japanese novels or something. I can't remember. It's a very marketing style name. But they're text not textbooks. There were like actual books like aimed at intermediate level learners where they take classic Japanese texts and they've got sort of running dictionaries on each page. So all those words that you would have had to look up, they're right there.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like these books are written to teach you. So they'll have like they had this little like skull icon, and so they'd be like, okay, this word is appearing in the glossary, but there's a skull icon next to it, which means the next time it shows up, you better know what it means. We're not going to put it in the next page's glossary, and so you could sort of slowly pick up all of the all of the words that you didn't know, and rely on the glossaries for the stuff that's like truly obscure. And I found those to be very helpful.
It's almost like the Shakespeare novels I had to do at school, because it was written in the English of the time, and some of the
Right.
language is adapted and using metaphors and stuff. There was like a running glossary on the, or almost like a dictionary on each page where it have little notations telling you what they show you the original text, and underneath it explain what it meant. Some things we had to try and work out for ourselves because it was obviously marketed as a book for school. So there's some things we
Hmm.
have to work out for ourselves, but certain other things were translated, quote unquote, or explained
Yeah.
in more detail. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know, I haven't done
Makes
it.
a lot of sense.
I haven't read anything actually in Spanish. It's something I should do as a while back. Catalonia has a very nice tradition, which is they celebrate, well, in Catalan it'd be Sant Jordi's Day,
Hmm.
El Dia de Sant Jordi, St. George's Day in English, in April. And the tradition in Catalonia is people gift roses and books to each other. So I think it also coincides with, I can't remember exactly if it's International Book Day or World Book Day, and it's to coincide as well with, is it the death of Shakespeare and the death of Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote?
Oh,
And now I can't remember if it
yeah.
was the birthday or the death. I can't remember now. Um, but yeah, so there are bookstores everywhere in that, and I remember for one of them I did buy actually an Ian Rankin novel, because it was funny because you're now reading through all the Rebus
Yes.
all the Remus novels, which was something else I didn't intend to happen. The Alter Bridge one, I was kind of hoping you'd pick that up. I did didn't expect you to read through every Remus novel, but I did pick up the first one, Knots and Crosses. But now I'm a little bit further down the line. I should actually try and pick it up and see I can if I can get through it and just how difficult it really is. It'd be kind of neat
Yeah,
to
that
try.
would be cool.
But the fact I'm not reading
Yeah,
any books in English, then it might be a struggle to get through it in Spanish.
it might be. Yeah.
We'll have to see. I need to set my mind to it and say, like, do it.
Hmm. And of course, in terms of like midterm goals, just to get back to my little pitch here, uh, that doesn't have to be, you open up a book or a graded reader or something like that. Those are fun, but it doesn't have to be that. It could also be like, I want to eventually pass, N1 certification in Japanese. I just passed N5, right?
Right,
That's, you're on your way and you've got something to prove that you've hit this milestone. And that's a reinforcement for, your step along the journey.
right. Having something that you can point to and actually say, I did that, no matter what it
Hmm.
is, I think that's, especially in the early days, I was really proud and celebrated it when I had a conversation on my own in Spanish.
Hmm.
I'd go home and tell I spoke Spanish. I spoke Spanish. I'd be like, okay, good, good. Tell me. I did have one awkward incident though, and I am going to share it. I can't remember if I shared it before. I'm going to share it again. It's probably the only really embarrassing one I've had.
Mm.
I've been quite lucky, and I've not had many clangers. But this one clanger in particular was uh, I had to go to a company
Hmm.
to teach them English. Um, but I'd speak to the receptionist in Spanish, and at this point, my Spanish level was still quite low. I don't think I knew the future of that, but I think it's probably from this anecdote, I probably didn't know the future. I think that's pretty likely at this point. Um, and all the receptionist asked me as I was leaving the first day was, "Oh, when are you coming back?" And all I
Mm.
wanted to say was, "Oh, I'm teaching here again tomorrow." Now, in
Hmm.
English, that's fine. You can use present continuous for the future when it's something that's concrete and planned. You can't do that in Spanish.
Oh.
I knew present continuous, so my brain just went, "Oh, I'll just translate this literally, and nothing can go wrong." And I said, I'll repeat it in Spanish, even though it doesn't make any sense. I said, "Estoy enseñando aquí mañana," and I went home, and I was always doing like a victory dance on the way home. Going, I spoke Spanish, and it went well. Look at me, this is going great. Trying to celebrate objectives and
Hmm.
stuff. And then I told my wife when she got home, and I was like, I spoke Spanish. I spoke Spanish. Like, oh, tell me, tell me, tell me. And I told her, and she just had this look on her face, like, oh my god,
Oh
what
no.
have you done? And she was like, you can't use the present continuous like that. And then all the happiness just kind of sapped out of me.
Oh no.
I was like, what do you mean? It's like
Oh.
the future only works with the future tense, or you have to say like I'm going to. There's no
Mm.
present continuous for like fixed plans in the future in Spanish, unlike in English. So then
Mm.
cue me walking past the same receptionist the next day with, I don't know, a piece of paper or my hand across my face, like you don't see me.
Yeah.
The conversation yesterday didn't happen. Um,
uh,
but I often I always go back to that story, right? Because you need to make mistakes, and that's just going to be the
yeah.
way you'll learn. But you need to celebrate it then when you get through. Even if you didn't make mistakes, you got through a situation, and whatever the outcome of that conversation was, you reach the outcome, and that's something that
Absolutely.
you need to either with your teacher or with the people around you or whoever or yourself celebrate that. Um,
Hmm.
and that will give you a lot of confidence. It's not just oh, I'm getting really bogged down with this grammar and I'm going nowhere. No, look at all the stuff you did over the last X number of years and all months or however long you've been learning and all the stuff you can do. I think it's so
Hmm.
easy for us to fixate on the negatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, buy yourself a cake, right? Like, like absolutely, like give yourself a day at the hot springs, right? Like
Right.
find ways to like actually physically enjoy the celebration. Don't just be like, "Yay!" right?
Hmm.
uh like actually give yourself some tangible rewards because that's like, yeah, it helps just reinforce that idea, right? That you get good things from good outcomes, and that's great.
Yeah.
And that can help give you the energy to keep going, which again, like my contention is that's the chief battle when you're learning a language is you got to just keep going.
Because you will get
And
there. Yeah.
yeah. And so finally that brings us to sort of long-term goals as a topic. And the first thing I want to say is fluency is a very bad long-term goal. It's too vague, and it's because of that you're too prone to moving the goalposts on yourself. Am I fluent in Japanese? I don't know. Like I cannot. Like if you take a computer away from me and ask me to write something down, I can do hiragana and katakana. I can't do kanji. I can't do it.
Hmm.
And I can speak in Japanese, but I haven't done so in years, so I'm rusty. I can do my job. I'm a translator, so I my understanding of Japanese is really high. Like I feel confident in my listening ability and my reading ability. But that's only two of the four aspects that you really consider understanding the language.
Right.
And it's so am I fluent? I don't know. Like I tend to be sort of humble. I tend to err on the side of saying no, and I'm probably never going to get to the point where I will say yes. And something that we sort of touched on but never really gotten into, I don't think, is there are like distinct fields of language that are associated with certain things. And you can even get this like in genres, right? Like when I started reading Japanese novels, I started reading a lot of like detective fiction, and so I learned a lot of very specific words and grammar patterns that was from detective fiction.
Hmm.
And then I moved to another genre, I think it was fantasy, and it was a totally different set of conventions. And I was like, oh, there's all these new words that I need to learn just for this different genre. And that's not even getting into like, okay, well, do you know medical terms? Do you know
Right.
legal terms? Do you know like all these different like sectors that are like gated by terminology even in your native language, right? So fluency, I feel like is just a bad like because you're never going to get there. You don't want to set yourself a long-term goal that you will actually never reach. And like I said towards the start, long-term goals or like the language learning process in general, just continual.
Yeah. I think also I mean, you kind of said it too. Like that, an objective like that is something that uh, is too. You're gonna shift the goalposts. You, if you say I want to be more fluent, and then you progress, and a year later you might have still the same objective, but you are more fluent than you were before. But now you're
Hmm.
looking at it from a more advanced position, but you're still even more aware of the things you don't know.
Hmm.
So that's almost like one you're never going to reach. I don't think. I mean,
Exactly.
unless you
Yeah.
suddenly,
Alternatively, you could be one of those people who's like the opposite of me, who are like, "Oh, I studied Japanese for 6 months, and now I speak it. I can communicate. I'm fluent."
right?
Uh,
That's living from like the more ignorance is bliss, right? Where you take
yeah.
minimal, not minimal ability. I don't want to say like, but there's still a lot of things that you haven't reached or learnt yet,
Hmm.
but you really amplify the positives, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and it doesn't help that that's like an actual psychological thing, right? Like they
yeah,
go through that famous like curve where it's like you know a little bit about something and you feel like you know a lot. And then you start to learn more and you realize how much you don't know. And
right,
then you learn a lot and you sort of and a lot of the time it circles back to like, oh, like they do it with like fun statements. It's like, oh, this is clearly true. And then you go through this long period where like, well, technically it's true, but it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this other thing, and you get to the advanced level understanding, and it's like, yeah, this is true. It's like you come full circle.
hmm The same with anything though.
Yeah.
I even like I'm thinking like something like learning board games, Fear of Dracula.
Hmm.
You get over a certain hurdle and you think you're a genius, and then you see this plethora of all the other things that you need to consider. Um,
Hmm.
so I was even with I mean anything. I studied science, exactly the same. Those
Hmm.
groundbreaking moments in high school where you suddenly discover, I don't know, something random. You discover what a d orbital is, and
Hmm.
that's just a brain melting moment, game changing moment. And then with hindsight, you look back at it and go, that was incredibly basic. And there's so much more to it than that, but I think that's kind of any learning process you're going to go through those stages. I'm kind of I don't know, I'm a really annoying person. I'm kind of the opposite to that. I will never say that I know a lot. It's only more recently
Yeah.
where I've had to kind of admit to myself and say, I've still got a lot to learn, but
Hmm.
my Spanish is getting pretty good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm in a situation where I'm going to keep learning. I'm not going to get to B2 and then drop it. I want to keep
Hmm.
going. I want to keep pushing through it. But when I was in the earlier learning process, I'm a very annoying person. I
Hmm.
want to keep learning more, and I've been saying this now to people. I've been doing it in English the other way, where I got my head around the present in Spanish, but then immediately I was getting very frustrated because I didn't know how to say things in the past, and all I want to do is learn in the past, learn in the past. I didn't think, look at me, I'm doing great.
Hmm.
I was felt restricted because I couldn't speak in the past. And the minute I got the past tense more or less sorted, I was then getting very frustrated because I couldn't say things in the future. I was always looking at the things. I'm just generally that type of person anyway, where I look at the things I don't know rather than things I do
Hmm.
know. And a lot of the times that actually causes more problems for me because then imposter syndrome and stuff starts creeping in.
Yeah.
And that's a real
Yeah.
a thing that I personally have to really work through, and sometimes it really restricts what I'm able to do. But in this sense, it didn't matter because I guess it wasn't for a job or something like that where there's um, something critical on the line. It's just me trying to learn something for my own benefit, and in that sense, I just get very annoyed at not getting to that 100%. I'm very perfectionist in that sense. So the minute
Yeah.
I got told the past, yeah, that's great, but how do we do the future?
Hmm.
And then it just keeps going. Now I'm starting
Yeah.
to settle down
Yeah.
and realize it's part of a process. I'm trying to enjoy the moment now that I
Hmm.
can speak about certain things and not stress about the things I don't know because I know I'll pick them up eventually.
Yeah. I tend to be that sort of way myself. Although I will say, it sounds like I pace myself a little bit differently than you do. Um, it's fun. Like I actually had this as an example of at a different point in the conversation, but I think it works now. Where one thing that I'm very good at is doing something steadily over a long period of time. And so when I set myself a goal, like I will just do a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And when I remember when I went to Japan, one of my friends who came in at the same time as me, his Japanese was maybe a little bit like not quite at the same level as mine, but we were close. And over the course of the 5 years that we both lived there, like I just slowly kept ramping up my level of Japanese, and like it got to the point where like and my friend wasn't really studying, and so wasn't really progressing, and all of a sudden in the third year of us living in Japan, my friend was like, I need to learn Japanese. And over the course of 2 years, he completely closed the gap between us and like shot past me. He was like studying like 5 hours a day, right? He just would not stop. And I was like, I cannot learn that way. Like if I wanted to, I would burn myself out. Like I can't function in a state where I just have to constantly be learning more all the time. Uh, so I need to pace myself out a little bit more. But when it comes to my instinct of do I know something, do I not know something, I definitely fall on the side of no, I don't know it. Right?
Mm.
Like no, I'm not fluent. I'm not fluent in Japanese. Right? That's a goal that I feel like I will never reach. Right? And I posed it as a question earlier, but like the way that I approach it is no. And I had sort of a similar realization at some point where it was like I know enough Japanese to read books. I know enough Japanese to watch TV. I can call people on the phone. I can do all this stuff. Like maybe I should start saying I'm good at Japanese,
Hmm.
even if I don't believe it.
Right. Live in that world of self confidence for a bit, and yeah, try and.
Right.
I mean, I think it's almost like everything too. Like if you're gonna give negative feedback to somebody, try to compliment it with
Hmm.
something else. And I feel at times we don't do that to ourselves enough. We do it to
Yeah.
other people to not make them feel bad, but maybe with ourselves we are our greatest critic. And sometimes we just need to look on both sides and take the good with the bad and not just focus on one all the time, especially the
Hmm.
negatives. Because again, it should be something that's challenging, but also fun and
Yeah. You should
rewarding.
be. Yep. You should be having fun along the way. You should be having learning experiences. Like one thing that's fun about learning languages, you learn a whole lot about a culture.
Yep,
It just comes with it. It's amazing.
yep. Because there's so
And
much you understand about human interaction and history and culture, which you can maybe learn without knowing the language. But oh my goodness, you just learn so much more from being able to
yeah.
directly interact with people, and you can see the way that they interact with each other and the
Hmm.
way they express certain things, and it gives you an insight into how people act and live, which is very interesting. If you go around with your eyes open and you purposefully look for these things, you can learn a lot about sort of society and the human condition in different cultures. It's very neat. Um,
Yep. And I felt like I couldn't just say like fluency is a bad goal. I thought I'd suggest some. So one suggestion that I would have, it may sound really obvious, but tests. Like not only do these make good midterm goals, they make good long-term goals,
hmm,
right? Because they're relatively objective and they're going to measure your level and they're achievable, right? There's a finite point at which you can say, I passed that test.
right.
So I'm good, right? And this is going to go back to sort of like needs and circumstances, right? Like, um, the test can be like the anchor that's like the end of one long-term goal, but then that like as a result opens up, okay, now I'm going to go and live in this country, right? And you live in that country and you're using your language constantly, and that's constantly getting reinforced. And so even though it's an endless process, you fixed that point as a long-term goal and you got there, and that's sort of the point where you can be like, okay, now I've got both feet on the ground. I've ended this phase of my process of language learning, and it's time to move on. Another long-term goal that I set is experiencing media, right? I brought that up as a midterm goal, but it can also be a long-term goal, just in the sense that like first of all, there's different grades, right? So there's different levels of appreciating media in its native language. There's definitely Japanese texts that are too advanced for me, especially if you go back into the past.
Mm-hmm.
Anything anything over 100 years old in Japanese, and it's like, what am I looking at?
Was the same with me. With I haven't touched the classic novel Don Quixote. I haven't touched it yet. I do know there are more modernized versions, which I need to get to first. But yeah, the original, I'm not going to be picking that up anytime soon,
Mm-hmm.
because I just know that's going to be very advanced. But yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And acknowledge that your end goal doesn't necessarily have to be complete mastery of a language, right?
Yeah,
Like different people are going to get different things out of the process. And not everybody needs to learn a new language entirely, right? So,
right. Heck, I don't know about you, but I definitely can't say that I have a complete fluency and mastery over my native tongue, let alone
yeah.
a foreign tongue. At the end of the day,
Hmm.
a language, the objective of a language is to understand and be understood.
Hmm.
And
Yep.
if you can do that more or less with a certain degree of accuracy, then the language is doing its job, and you're playing your part in terms of being the speaker or the listener. So that's fine. Mastery, I don't think comes in. I mean, if I start picking up English novels, I'm going to see loads of words I don't know. Um,
Hmm.
and I can say now I lack a certain poetic nature when I talk. I'm not very imaginative in that sense. I'm definitely from the more scientific realm. Um,
Hmm.
But if you ask me to write something, you know, we were talking about Jane Austen earlier, right? Of that sort, no chance. Um,
Yeah.
I'd crash and burn. Write a nice descriptive text. Nope, that's not going to
Hmm.
happen. So yeah, if mastery in your native tongue is almost near impossible, it's not completely impossible, but near impossible, then it shouldn't be a goal for a foreign language either.
Hmm.
That seems very fair.
Yep. And the other example I had for long term goal, I actually got this from YouTube channel that I recently discovered because they did a series of podcasts on the process of translation in Japanese video games, which is like my home territory. So I was super intrigued by that. It's a podcast called Resonant Arc, and they did an episode on this. There's two hosts, and one of them did a presentation of his language learning process, where his goal, his definition for a long term goal is I can understand the news if I listen to. So he's like, if I can get to the point where I can listen to the news, the world news that's being reported in Spanish, and just understand it without having to look anything up, then I consider that I've learned Spanish.
Hmm.
And he was talking about he had this approach where he was able to get to that point in like 4 months or something. So
Okay.
very impressive. But
Hmm. Definitely.
yeah.
Yeah.
But again, like something I'm not sure if I exactly remember saying it, but like it's one of those things where definitely be aware that other people's pace is not your own. Don't get frustrated with yourself for not being able to teach yourself a language in 4 months. There are people out there who can do that. That's their pace, not yours.
Right. Right. It's like anything. You're not going to learn at the same pace. You're going to learn by different methods and there's different pace. What somebody can do
Hmm.
something very well, maybe you can't, but then vice versa with something else. Um, which is why then, yeah, don't get stressed if you can't read so well. Don't worry because you'll have a strength somewhere else down the line that will then catch out other people.
Yep.
That's just yeah, that's always going to be the way. We're not all built the same. it's
Hmm.
yeah, but I think it's quite hard again, especially if people are coming from more academic backgrounds. They might become more sort of competitive because it will, especially earlier on when a lot of it becomes about grades and all this sort of thing. Um,
Yeah.
whereas if you, especially if you're learning language as an adult and you're removing yourself from that competitive environment, you can just
Hmm.
focus on you. And then I guess if you do a test of some sort or an exam, then the only person you're competing against is yourself or
Hmm.
the system. I mean, I did the B2 exam, I think, with 5 or 6 other people. I don't care about what they got. Completely
Right.
irrelevant to me if they passed or failed or got 100% or 40%. Means nothing to me.
Hmm.
The only thing that cares about is the thing that I got. Um,
Exactly.
I hope they all passed. Obviously, I don't wish for them to fail, but they're on their own
Yeah.
language learning journey, and I'm on mine. We can share experiences from it, but ultimately, the only thing I care about is did I pass? How well did I pass?
Hmm.
How much do I have to improve? Where am I going next? And all this sort of thing. So,
Yep. So yeah, I think that's basically all of my notes. I feel like I had some other things that I could have gotten into, but at this point, I feel like we've probably driven home the point enough. Uh, I will say, like as a final sort of concluding thought, one thing that I believe and that my experience was with Japanese was one of the real benefits of learning another language is it helps you see the world in a different way,
yeah.
and it helps expand sort of your entire world because anything that exists in say English, like it also exists in Japanese, and there are going to be aspects of it in Japanese that are different than you would ever considered in English.
Hmm.
And so it's learning a language is a way of expanding your world, and I think that's extremely cool. And even if you don't get to that far off, distant goal that maybe you've set yourself, that I've, tried to say, set up the structure of short term, midterm, long term goals. Even if you fall off somewhere along the way, uh, you're still in the process of expanding your world by attempting to learn a language. And I think that's awesome, and you should do it.
Yeah. I'll counter that point. I agree with that point, but also counter and add to it that not only does it open up your world, in terms of being able to connect with another culture, but it also makes you reconsider aspects of your own language and of your own culture.
Yes.
It makes you go back and think, oh wait, why is English like that? Where did that
Hmm.
come from? Or in my Spanish classes, for example, we often end up getting onto the conversation of Latin. Not that I know Latin, but my teacher did study it, and there are times where, she'll then explain to me, "All right, this word is in Spanish like this because the root comes from Latin, but it's evolved in Spanish, but then in Catalan it's different because of the way Catalan evolves slightly differently or not as much and so on. But then you see then how that connects into the English word, and then you see then the root comes from Latin, but then the Spanish word is slightly different because it evolved and all this sort of stuff. And then weird things in English about grammar rules or origins of certain vocabulary or whatever it is, right? It makes you think more deeply about your own mother tongue.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, very true. And just recontextualizes your life experiences.
yeah, I agree. I guess for you, maybe you don't have this problem necessarily, but now I'm having the main thing I'm having to try and consider thinking about goals and things is how far along this language learning path do I go, at least in terms of the formal learning experience with a
Hmm.
teacher. I'm always going to be learning. I'm I'm a sponge in this sense in terms of I always want to learn stuff.
Hmm.
So even if I stop formally, I will always just keep picking up Spanish along the way. But how far do I go along this journey
Hmm.
before I pick up formal learning of Catalan again? That's going to be
Right.
the net. Where exactly does that transition occur?
Hmm.
Um, and I don't quite know the answer yet. um,
Yeah.
I,
Yeah, that's the challenge. Is it's really difficult. Like it's easy for me to sit here and say, "Oh, you should set out the series of goals." It's really hard to actually do that.
I think I mean C1 would be. I mean, I know from the opposite way around when hear C1 speakers, genuine C1 speakers of English, it's a very high
Hmm.
level. So if I was able to get C1, I feel also confident that I would have learned enough Spanish and a lot of that foundation is very
Hmm.
solid. So even if I took time away from it and didn't actually speak so much Spanish or learn so much, and if I lost a little bit, that foundation would still be solid enough. I'd be able to come back and it wouldn't be, starting from scratch again. But then I guess the question would be, how long would it be until I do, say, the C1 exam to prove to myself that I've got that level? Can I do it in
Hmm.
2 years? But it depends what else is going on in my life. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, it's going to be something across the next year, 2 years, 3 years. I'm going to have to kind of contemplate and work out what I'm going to do and how it's going to work. I always knew when I stopped doing Catalan, I would come back to Catalan eventually.
Hmm.
Because again, it's a fun thing to try another language, but also because Catalan culture has unique aspects that the wider Spanish culture doesn't. Um,
Mm.
so it'd be definitely cool to sort of tap into that a little bit more. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm shrugging. I know you can't see me, but I'm shrugging. I don't know when that will be, but I'm picking it up a little bit. You know, I
Hmm.
I hear it all around me. You're going to pick up eventually. So
Yeah.
it's just in terms of a formal. I really thrive off formal learning settings. I'm not very good at self, especially with something so big as like a language. If it's a very small task, I can teach
Hmm.
myself something. But if this big, like a language is this massive thing they go try to
Yeah.
undertake. I do better with formal teaching. Um,
Hmm.
so I need to have somebody
Yeah.
sitting in front of me and also someone telling me, get that homework done, do this exercise, do this, because I need that sometimes. I need that little bit of
Right.
pushing sometimes.
Right.
It just depends on what
Absolutely.
the situation is. Sometimes I
Yeah.
can motivate myself, sometimes I can't, or I end up not managing my time and all this sort of thing correctly.
Hmm.
So I know, for example, I've got homework to do. I've got to listen to a podcast. That's another thing which we didn't really get into, but um, the thing I'm learning at the moment is I've learned all these grammar rules, and the main thing in Spanish is that everything has a gender, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have to think about pluralizing them and all this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But now, especially with the way that society is changing, there's the whole thing about inclusive language. In Spanish, el
Mm-hmm.
lenguaje inclusivo. There we go. Um, and now suddenly learning, right, all those grammar rules, so the way it works, I don't know how it works in Japanese, but the way it works in, obviously in English we don't have this problem. In Spanish, you use the masculine plural form of at least the
Mm-hmm.
article and maybe the word if you're talking about a mixed group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there are, and again, I'm not going to get into the argument in terms of if you should or shouldn't do this. That's not really my place to say, but I have my own
Mm-hmm.
opinions, but it's just purely an opinion. It's not based on anything, particularly
Right.
scientific. But there are people who say that shouldn't be the case, and then the language is trying to adapt towards a more inclusive form. And there are different ways
Mm-hmm.
you can do it. There are ways you can do it without having to think about articles and the what was it in English, morpheme,
Yeah.
right? Changing. You can use passive voice, so you ignore the subject and all this sort of thing, or you try to use a noun which is not people, but it's like the collective term. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you're not using like the name of like the specific person, but eventually you're gonna have to start confronting, even if you use a word like welcome, bienvenido, right? That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a group, bienvenidos, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but then what about if it's right? If it's a group of, if it's mixed, now what do you do? Do you say bienvenidos y
Right.
bienvenidas? Do you start changing the letter to something different? And it's a whole. The problem is then it becomes political now because it's a debate
Yes.
about conservatism versus
Yeah. I
progression,
was
all this sort of stuff. But then that's the
I was basically going to say, like, you say English doesn't have this problem. It does have this problem. It just has it in a different way. It's the same
right.
thing with Japanese. Japanese has this. Japanese, you don't have like genders for nouns, but there are aspects of Japanese speech that, in terms of inclusivity and, how different levels of politeness and the way they work and all these things that, like, okay, yeah, this there are some issues that, we were talking about how like culture is baked into language. Yeah, absolutely it is, and that's contentious, right? So
Because
yeah,
then
I mean the context, it
if you attack the
go
language,
ahead.
you're attacking the culture.
Yes, absolutely. And some aspects of the culture will say like we love this part of the language, and other people will be like we want to get rid of that part of the language, right? And
Hmm.
you've had you've had this sort of push pull. Like I feel like every language has its struggles in this regard and has like throughout history.
Right.
So
I think the only reason I'd say that English still has this debate, but it's because of the way the language is formed. There are not as many cases where
yeah.
it crops up. We have a gender neutral word they already, so that's a problem solved
Hmm.
already. Okay, whether or not we use it is it now, then that's a different story. But in Spanish,
Yeah.
there isn't a gender neutral word. So what do you do now?
Right.
Do we have to invent
Well,
one?
how do you feel about they for the singular? How do you feel about themself?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh yeah,
I
if you
mean,
don't mind.
me personally, I've got no issue with it.
Yeah, I have no issue with it either, but some people do. And technically, there is a potential issue, even in English, of number confusion, right?
Right,
Because they is a
right.
plural at the end of the day. And yes, there are native English cases of using they plural for a singular person just when you don't know who that person is,
Hmm.
right?
Yep,
I don't even know who they are, right? That's totally natural. No one's going to argue with that usage.
right,
But there are cases where it can be ambiguous when you're using a plural form for a singular person.
right.
And I personally have no problem with that.
Mm,
But there are some people who do. And I
mm,
think some of the reasons that those people have problems with it sometimes are bad. And sometimes they're totally just grammatical, right?
right.
Because I have been in situations as a translator where I have to think about, like, what do I do for this person in this situation? And I've gone back and forth on it with editors. And it's been like, okay, well, it's unclear, right?
Mm,
So we need to clarify this. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't mind clarifying it. So
right.
uh, I don't think it's. I agree with you that there's fewer points of contention in English, but they are still contentious.
Of course. of course. And then it comes down to political lines. I mean, for me personally, the they thing is something I'm trying to get even more baked into my brain because of doing like the streaming. And
Likewise. Well,
when some
yeah,
people,
I don't even have the streaming contest. I'm just trying to bake it into my brain in general.
right,
It's surprisingly hard to shift a habit that I've been forming my entire life without knowing it.
right, right. I think, especially in terms of the streaming and around the topic of video games and things,
Hmm.
there's a presumed, uh, yeah, there's a huge presumption that the majority audience are male. But
Hmm.
I already know by people I've interacted with, even without even thinking about potential non-binary and all this sort of thing. Just I know that there have been women come into my chat because of the game I'm playing, or I've raided
Hmm.
somebody and it's clearly a woman. So I
Hmm.
can't go around saying guys all the time if I'm using it purely as a male way, or saying he for everybody. I just can't
Hmm.
do that anymore. I cannot assume anything, um,
Right.
especially when also then the username is completely ambiguous as well, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm trying to get it into my skull that I use the word they until it's proven to me otherwise by
Hmm.
one way or another. Um, but that again, yeah. Then I was trying to listen to a podcast about this in Spanish, and they're trying to talk about how you know some people argue, from a grammatical perspective, no, these are grammatical rules, and you cannot change them. And even they're talking about
Yeah.
how there are poets or linguists who will manipulate every single aspect of the language they can to change emphasis or make it whatever, right? Whatever form they want.
Yeah.
Oh no, but don't you dare change
Yeah.
the articles and the grammar and all this sort of thing, right? It just becomes very interesting. Again, it's political, but again, that's the problem. It's language and culture is so ingrained, but then the problem is then
Hmm.
you got to be careful if you attack one, it feels like you're attacking the other. It's the whole thing too of different story, but the suppression of Gaelic in Scotland, or the suppression in
Hmm.
of Catalan during the dictatorship of Franco,
Hmm.
right? Um, where Catalan was not allowed in education and all this, and then it
Hmm.
felt it's not just you're not just attacking a language, you're also attacking the intrinsic culture of that region, and
Yes.
then that's why nowadays there are people who are very defensive about Qatar. And
Hmm.
I'm going to say this now: the 99, I mean, no, I'm going to say not 99%, 100% of all the people that I have met have been really good with me. They have never
Hmm.
looked at me and looked down on me because I'm speaking Spanish. They
Hmm.
don't I've never had any issue, but there are people who get very defensive, um,
Yep.
and they will be incredibly insistent about speaking Catalan. But
Yeah.
that's just that's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
um, and but then that's the thing. Then that the only reason I brought it up, that whole point about inclusive languages and stuff, is the fact that I've gone through this entire process of learning a language and it's done this particular way, and now we're saying everything you've kind of learned, we're gonna have to kind of tear it up a little bit,
Hmm.
and you got to think about different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Which you have to get to a high level before you even think about that.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, but it's another aspect of the never-ending process of learning languages, right? It's
right,
if quite frankly, like even if you take out contentious elements and just look at the natural drift in language over the years, like my I've been watching this anime called Hajime no Ippo recently. May have talked about it. It's a boxing show,
hmm
and it's clear that whoever the original translator for the anime was working on this show in like around the 90s, like maybe early 2000s or something like that, just because, and was American, just because of the way they phrase certain things. And like you'll go for most of the episode and not even like think about it, and then all of a sudden the character will be like big whoop. And it's like, okay, I don't think I've heard that phrase in 20 years.
right.
What's going on?
Well,
And it's not that it's wrong. Like there are some people who I started to say this and then sort of stopped. But the context that the conversation I was talking about that happened on this Resonant Arc podcast is in the fact that there are some people who feel very strongly about the way that Japanese gets translated into English, and they not necessarily all of them, but some of them at least seem to be politically motivated. And these people who are on this podcast wanted to step in and be like, uh, okay, we're going to try and address the legitimate aspect of these concerns. We're going to try and form this neutral ground where we can talk about what the state of the industry actually is. Are we dealing with like rogue translators or cabals of uh, linguists who are forcing their culture on a broader group of people because they just happen to be the elites who speak the Japanese language? It's a very contentious issue, and it sort of makes me hesitant to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But but there's this aspect of the way that they talk about things that I think I don't know. They try to have this sort of neutral approach. And one of the things that people will talk about in this sort of contentious debate is stuff that seems relatively inoffensive, like the use of terms like big whoop. People will talk about slang, right? It's like, oh, if you're a translator, you should never use slang because it's going to be dated. Uh, you can't tell what part of language is going to be dated, right? Some slang gets incorporated and becomes 100% natural, and it'd be weird not to use it. And especially because it's not like English is the only language that has slang. Guess what? Japanese has slang too. How do you translate Japanese slang without using English slang? That seems like a cop out, all right?
Right.
And an exercise in futility, because like I said, like there are just going to be markers of a translation that you can see, right? We go back to this translator who was working on Hajime no Ippo back in the day, who's doing a great job, and they just happened to use this phrase that was totally normal and is now like, oh, that was written in the 90s.
Right. But actually, you can only do that only with hindsight. You can work out what is dated. But it's the same even in when you watch TV series in your native tongue.
Yeah.
There'll be certain things that will date it if it's either visual, because of the one was watching Breaking Bad relatively recently, and I was watching going, oh, okay, well, this could be set in any time period, and then the minute they brought out the flip phones, I was like, no.
Yeah.
Mid-2000s. Right? So, and then also the things that people say, if there's cultural references that get, especially if it's like comedies and stuff, love using cultural references, that's going to date, that's going to date stuff.
Yeah.
The one that always comes up, I don't know, is raining cats and dogs an expression that American people are aware of or they use?
They're definitely aware of it. I am anyway. I don't know if we use it very often.
Okay. Well, the consensus is that British people don't use it anymore.
Oh,
I don't.
okay.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone use it. But the thing is, every time I say to class, right, we're gonna do idioms, and I explain what an idiom is because it gets confusing because there's the word idioma, which means language in Spanish, which is just a big false friend.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
And then they realize, oh, right, frase hecha. Yes, an expression, exactly, right. And then, like, what is the most famous idiom you know? Oh, raining cats and dogs. Oh, great, every student knows it. Well, guess what? British people don't use it. If you go there and say it, they're going to look at you weirdly. They'll understand it, but they'll be like, we don't use that anymore. You're about
That's
30
funny.
years too late. So, and even there are idioms that I have seen in advanced, like even C1 level. I'm not even talking about C2, which is C2 level. It's just mental. C1 level textbooks, not often, but sometimes I'll see an idiom and go, huh? I don't know that idiom. That's something I haven't come across. And then I'll ask my mum, who's obviously of a different generation, and she'll go, oh yeah, obviously that I used that when I was a kid. Or whatever. So regional differences, generational differences, things will date or become incorporated, and it's not slang. Like I think when the word cool fit under that bracket, that was slang, but now
definitely.
everyone just uses it without thinking. Or word like picturesque. We talked about no, it's not slang. We used about picturesque earlier. Now the meaning's changed. It's become something completely not completely different, but it's the meaning has become a little bit more vague.
Yep.
That's what languages do. So
yeah, that's just the nature. That's just the nature of language. It changes over time, and so you're always going to have to be keeping up with it, right?
Right.
So that's just something that's inevitable, and that's something that I'm trying to plan a trip to Japan for this year, and part of that's just because I haven't been there in a long time, and I want to see some of the ways that I want to watch some Japanese TV because I want to see some of the ways that the language has evolved in the time that I haven't really refreshed my understanding.
Hmm. You got to be careful. You might be going there and you'll be hearing all this slang that you won't know what's going on.
Yeah, maybe. Uh, yeah, Japanese has some aspects of it that are fairly impenetrable. They tend to abbreviate things a lot too, which doesn't help.
Oh, it keeps you on your toes. It's like I discovered in French. I think it's verlan is their slang. I don't speak French. I can't remember. They've got a certain slang where they take
Hmm.
normal words and reverse the order of the syllables or of
Oh.
the letters. But the problem is, what happens now is if the slang word becomes common enough that the dictionary accepts it as an official
Mm.
word, it will then get reversed again,
Oh.
so it's like double reverse slang.
Wow.
So not if you go to France, not only do you have to learn the normal slang, which is confusing enough because
Hmm.
all these regular words start getting switched round, but then you have to
Hmm.
reverse it all again.
Wow.
So yeah, it's I haven't even got into Spanish slang yet. I mean, I know there's a lot,
Hmm.
but just trying to deal with swears is enough. I haven't even got into slang yet.
Hmm.
But so that's probably the next challenge, is trying to. But that will be once I get into a Spanish speaking workplace, that will definitely help. I think with that.
Hmm.
But yeah, there'll be bits and things that you got to try to, which are going to be more difficult, or you're going to just evade because you're not in the right situation. But that's all part of the process, which makes it fun.
Absolutely. Yep. It expands your world and it changes you. Learn a language today.
Yay! There you go. There's the tagline.
There you go.
um, I think we could. I don't know why. I was gonna say I should go to bed, but I'm also hungry, which is probably not good for 1:30 in the morning. But
Mm.
whatever is happening with me, either through tiredness or through hunger, I think we have to wrap this up.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. I think this is a good one.
We've definitely gone through some stuff, gone through some
Yeah.
more sort of technical things and also anecdotes. So yeah, nice little mixture of things. Very much, at least for me, anyways. Very much just off the cuff, no notes in front of me at all. You did all the heavy lifting.
I did.
I don't
And we
know.
didn't even get to it for like an hour,
Well, that's
maybe
true.
two.
Yeah. I don't know what's next. I don't know. We'll have to look, we'll have to go back onto our list. I haven't opened that document for a while. We'll have to see
Yeah,
what's up next.
I was looking at it the other day. There was a good number of other possibilities that like even without having to brainstorm new ones, we've got still plenty on the list. I knew we were potentially talking about, you know, funny travel stories and things.
Oh, that'd be completely anecdotal. That'd be fun. That would be
Yeah.
fun.
And that one I won't like even I who randomly sits down and preps like weird fully annotated arguments about language learning. Even I will not be able to prepare anything for that one. I'll just show up and we can let some stories fly.
Hmm. Especially with the long distance trips that you had to do. I could definitely imagine
Yeah.
some wacky stuff. I've had not exceedingly wacky, but especially sort of Scottish cultural things, which you can definitely bring in.
Hmm.
So yeah, there'll definitely be some stuff. We'll check it out. We'll figure it out.
That's right. Yep. And as longtime listeners know, there's no guarantee that what we just talked about will actually be the next podcast, but
Well,
maybe.
that is true. That is definitely true. Very we are very used to deviating off topic within the podcast and between them as well.
Very true.
I was
Yeah,
just
if you somehow made it to the end of this, thank you.
absolutely. I was going to very quickly ask before we go, because I meant to do it at the beginning and then I forgot. Since we did our Desert Island Discs, have you been able to sort of revisit anything or discover anything new since then?
In terms of music? Oh,
Yeah.
well, I advanced further in the Alter Bridge discography.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
So
you did send me a message about that. You checked out Walk the Sky. That's right.
I did, yep, Walk the Sky, which I've only listened to it once so far, and my initial impression was, this feels like it's less for me. Like I went through a process with Alter Bridge where it was like I feel like each album is getting closer and closer to my like sweet spot, like where I really enjoy music. And this one felt like they took a step out of that sweet spot. So
Mm,
I don't know. But you never do know. I've only listened to it once, and you never do know what'll happen when on a re-listen. And as you've said in the past about Alter Bridge, yeah, they may not always be your favorites, but any Alter Bridge song is a pretty good song. So
right. You're comparing Alter Bridge to Alter Bridge, and then
right.
being very critical, rather than being, let's compare Alter Bridge to everything else, and even
Hmm.
their maybe subjectively worse songs are still pretty good uh,
Hmm.
compared to maybe the rest of the field. So yeah, I'm trying to remember. I did start listening to the Dream Theater album that got
Oh, cool.
featured, but then I think I got interrupted. I didn't listen to it all the way through. Um,
Mm.
I went to a Led Zeppelin tribute concert recently, so I was listening to. I've
Oh,
been doing a little bit of driving recently as well, so it's been quite nice. I
cool.
could just put on whatever music I want. So I did have a day where I drove for about an hour and I had Led Zeppelin on the go, and
Nice.
that was nice. And then there's also a Danish band called Vola, which I had just
Hmm.
on shuffle, and it was really good. Because especially going, you could start playing some of their older stuff that I've never heard, and then the only disappointment with my Desert Island Disc now looking back on it was, um, and not it's not that I want to pander to a particular crowd or anything, but I was just a bit disappointed that there was no female artists on my list. Um,
I noticed that about mine too. I was like, that's too bad.
so I was trying to think if there was one, what would I put? And I think the one I would put there's a band called Ginger,
Hmm.
who are originally from Eastern Ukraine, um, and there's a song called Wallflower that I'd probably put for Desert Island Disc. It's not probably my favorite song from them, but in terms of what I take on a
Hmm.
Desert Island Disc, it would be that. But they've just released a new album actually last Friday. So I was
Oh, cool.
before we recorded this podcast, I was standing in the kitchen doing the dishes and listening to it. Again, haven't made it all the way through yet, but it's heavy.
Mm.
I'm glad some a band like that. Some bands maybe go as they become more and more famous, they become a little bit softer, but they're just going really
Hmm.
heavy and really chunky riffs and stuff. So, but that's kind of been it. I've just kind of been going all over the place. There's not been a very concrete thing, but I'm going to listen to this discography. To be honest, I'm just listening to
Yeah.
mostly what people would call lo-fi. I'm actually dreading my Spotify Wrapped at the end of the year because the thing I'm probably listening to most is just this lo-fi quote unquote music that I play on
Hmm.
the stream.
Ah, yep. That'll
Um,
do it.
and even though it's a 10-hour playlist, it still seems to play the same songs. Even though my streams are normally like 3 hours long each. So yeah, but it's nice and chill. There's quite a lot of there's quite a bit of sax actually. There, I tried to find all the jazz stuff and put that in there.
Oh, nice. Cool.
Um, so I would
Yeah,
have.
there's one thing that I might revise on my list also is that I noticed for all the different like formative periods of my life and experiences and things that I represented, I didn't have anything from a video game. It's like, I put
Oh.
two anime songs on there. I think one of those should probably, if I were to do it again, shift that off and put in some video game music because there's a lot of video game music that I like, and it was hugely informative of my tastes in
Hmm.
music, I think, because like you've noticed in me, I think, a tendency to appreciate prog, and I think that's because a lot of the games that I grew up playing, they were composed. The music in them was composed by people who love prog. They just love prog rock, and we're like, we want to make our video games sound like that. They put it in their games, and now it's like I've been listening to it without knowing what I was listening to. And so when I discovered the like inspirations for these video game artists, it was like, oh, no wonder I like this stuff.
So it's kind of the opposite with me. The one game with a soundtrack that really sticks in my mind is the Need for Speed Most Wanted soundtrack. And a lot of that is
Ah.
there's like a mixture of like hip hop, but there's also quite a lot of sort of rock in there and metal.
Hmm.
But at the time that I was playing that game, I didn't have the uh, sort of the motivation, but also inclination to go and research those bands.
Hmm.
I just listened to the music, and it was just almost in a vacuum. All right, it's the music in the game. I didn't think
Hmm.
about there'd be a whole discography of a band to discover. It's only now looking back afterwards, going back in time and seeing some of the bands on that list, and there's like Avenged Sevenfold and Bullet for My Valentine. I think Mastodon is on there, and thinking, oh my goodness, past me was stupid. I should have gone and investigated these bands. I would have discovered such great music earlier on. But
Wow.
it's okay. It's fine.
Yep.
Get around to it.
You got there eventually.
Got there eventually.
Yep.
Exactly. So, oh well. Very good. Well, shall we bring this to a close? But I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. I definitely did.
Likewise.
Anyway, it wasn't quite the conversation I envisaged it would be, but there's definitely a lot of nice stuff in there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this was totally up my alley, right?
Yeah.
I'm a translator. I know a lot of people who tried to learn the language. I love talking about language, so this was absolutely like tailor-made for me to enjoy. But true to form, I loved having this conversation with you. So
Absolutely.
thank you for
Likewise.
having me on to talk about it. And I
Oh.
hope we didn't bore everyone else to tears.
Oh, we'll find out when the podcast comes out, I suppose. But I hope, yeah,
We will.
if anyone's reached the end of this, and I hope it's kept you company. Whether you've sat through the whole almost 4 hours or you've just seen it in chunks, that's okay. If anybody's listening and you're on a language learning journey of your own, feel free to comment and let us know where you're at and how things have been going. And yeah, we'll catch you again. So this podcast, unless no, it's not gonna. No, there's no way this is gonna come out in the middle of February. We'll just say this is coming out at the beginning of March.
Yeah.
We'll see what we can do for you, but at the very latest, we'll see you at the beginning of April. So I hope, as I said, hope March is a good month for you. And we'll, well, I was gonna say we'll see you when we see you, but we're not seeing you. That doesn't quite work. We'll be here talking when
Yeah.
we can.
We'll look forward to keeping you company again soon.
That's better. That's probably a better way to end. Yes. There you go. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much for watching
All right.
and
Bye-bye.
listening. Bye bye.